They told me my children were too loud, too messy, too embarrassing for my sister's perfect wedding. My own family, the people who were supposed to love us unconditionally, looked me in the eye and said, "Don't bring your kids, you understand." I understood all right. I understood that to them, my children weren't family. They were inconveniences, mistakes, noise that disrupted their picture-perfect image. So I did exactly what they asked. I stayed home. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply said, "We won't be attending," and hung up the phone. They thought that was the end of it. They thought I'd crawl back, eventually apologize for existing, and accept my place as the family embarrassment. But here's what they didn't know: I'd spent years being underestimated, years being dismissed. And in that time, I'd learned something powerful: grace can be more devastating than any argument. So when Christmas came around, I made one small, quiet decision. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just one simple change. And that single act didn't just shock my family. It destroyed everything they thought they knew about me, my children, and who really held the power in our story. What happened next exposed secrets that had been buried for decades, shattered reputations built on lies, and proved that the daughter they threw away had become someone they never saw coming. By the end, they were begging for mercy from the woman they'd called an embarrassment. Stay with me. Because this story doesn't just end with revenge. It ends with redemption so powerful the people who rejected us spent years trying to undo what they'd done. And it all started with 3 words: "We won't be attending." My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm 23 years old, a recent graduate with a degree in literature, and until tonight I was considered the crown jewel of one of Connecticut's most respected families. My father, Harold Walsh, built an empire in commercial real estate. My mother, Eleanor, chaired every charity board worth mentioning, and I was supposed to be their masterpiece, educated, elegant, destined to marry well and carry on the family legacy. But tonight, standing in the center of our grand ballroom, surrounded by crystal and champagne, I'm about to destroy all of that with 7 words I can no longer keep inside. The evening started like every Walsh event, flawlessly orchestrated, suffocatingly perfect. My father's 60th birthday party filled our Connecticut estate with 200 guests who mattered: business partners, politicians, old money families whose names appeared in history books. The chandeliers cast diamond patterns across marble floors. A string quartet played Mozart in the corner. Waiters in white gloves circulated with champagne and canapes that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. I wore the dress my mother picked out, a pale blue silk that made me look virginal and expensive, exactly what a Walsh daughter should be. My hair was swept into an elaborate updo that took 2 hours. My smile was practiced perfect and completely hollow. I'd been holding this secret for 3 months. 3 months of morning sickness hidden behind closed bathroom doors. 3 months of terror growing alongside the life inside me. 3 months of knowing that the man who got me pregnant, a graduate student I'd met at a literature conference, someone my family would consider beneath us, had vanished the moment I told him. He wasn't from our world. He didn't have the right last name, the right pedigree, the right bank account. And now he was gone, and I was alone with a truth that would detonate my family like a bomb. I thought I could hide it. I thought maybe I could figure something out quietly, privately, without anyone ever knowing. But this afternoon, my mother walked into my bedroom without knocking and found me crying over a positive pregnancy test I'd foolishly left on my dresser. The look on her face, horror, disgust, panic, told me everything I needed to know about what would happen next. She'd given me an ultimatum: confess tonight at the party in front of everyone so the family could control the narrative and decide how to handle the situation. Or she would tell my father herself, and it would be even worse. So here I stand halfway through the evening watching my father accept birthday toasts and backslaps from men who respect him, admire him, fear him. My sister Sarah glides through the crowd in her designer dress, 21 and perfect, everything I was supposed to be. She catches my eye and smiles, oblivious to what's coming. My mother hovers near the doorway, her face a mask of composure, but I see her hands gripping her champagne glass so tightly, her knuckles have gone white. She's waiting. Time's up. My father taps his glass with a fork, calling for attention. The room quiets. He's about to give a speech thanking everyone for coming for celebrating with him. This is the moment my mother indicated with a slight nod of her head an hour ago, the moment when the family has everyone's attention, when we control the room. I feel my legs moving before my mind fully agrees. I'm walking toward the center of the ballroom, my heels clicking on marble, every eye turning toward me. My father looks surprised, but pleased. He thinks I'm going to say something sweet, something daughterly. His smile is warm, proud. It breaks my heart because I know what's about to happen to it. Dad. I hear myself say, my voice somehow steady despite the earthquake inside my chest. I need to tell you something. I need to tell everyone something. The room is so quiet I can hear the champagne bubbling in glasses. My father's smile begins to fade, confusion creasing his forehead. My mother's face has gone from pale to gray. I force the words out before I lose my nerve. I'm pregnant. I'm not married. The father is gone. And I'm keeping the baby. The silence that follows is the loudest sound I've ever heard. It seems to stretch and warp time itself. I watch my father's face transform through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, comprehension, and finally rage so pure and terrible it makes him unrecognizable. His face turns a deep, mottled red. Someone's champagne glass hits the floor and shatters, the crash echoing through the frozen ballroom. No one moves to clean it up. You. My father's voice comes out strangled, barely human. He takes a step toward me, and I instinctively step back. You disgraceful, selfish little whore. The words hit me like physical blows. Someone gasps, maybe multiple people. How dare you? How dare you stand in my house in front of these people and humiliate this family? Everything we've built, everything we've stood for, you've destroyed it with your weakness, your stupidity, your complete lack of respect. I try to speak, to explain, but he's not done. Who is he? Who's the father? When I don't answer immediately, his voice rises to a shout that makes everyone flinch. Answer me! He's gone, I whisper. He left. My father laughs, but it's a horrible sound full of contempt. Of course he did, because you're not worth staying for. You're nothing but a disappointment wrapped in expensive clothes. He turns to address the room as if he's explaining a business failure to investors. My daughter, ladies and gentlemen, the pride of the Walsh family, pregnant and abandoned like some common Harold. My mother's voice cuts through his tirade, quiet but sharp. She's moved to his side, her face a carefully constructed mask that shows nothing. But her silence speaks volumes. She won't defend me, won't tell him to stop. She just wants him to stop making a scene in front of their guests. That's when Sarah moves. My little sister, my confidant since childhood, steps backward as if I'm contagious. I can't, she says, her voice high and panicked, looking around at our relatives and family friends staring at us. I can't be associated with this shame. I have my reputation to think about. My future. She's crying, but not for me, for herself, for what my scandal might cost her. Everyone's going to think we're all like this now. The betrayal of that moment cuts deeper than my father's words, deeper than my mother's silence. Sarah and I shared secrets, dreams, late-night conversations about the lives we wanted. And now she's looking at me like I'm a stranger who's broken into our home and stolen something precious. My father turns back to me, and his voice drops to something cold and final. Get out. Pack one bag. You're leaving tonight. You are no longer welcome in this house or in this family. We will tell people you've gone abroad for studies. You will not contact us. You will not use our name. You are nothing to us now. Harold, not tonight, my mother murmurs. The guests. She made her choice in front of our guests, he snaps. Let her face the consequences in front of them too. He looks at me with such disgust, I feel it like acid on my skin. You have 1 hour. After that, the locks will be changed. I stand there for one more moment, looking at the faces staring back at me. Some show shock, others barely concealed pleasure at witnessing such spectacular drama. A few show pity, which somehow feels worse than the judgment. These people who smiled at me an hour ago, who complimented my dress, who told me I looked radiant, now they see me as a scandal, a cautionary tale they'll tell at their own dinner parties. I turn and walk toward the grand staircase, my heels clicking in the silence. No one stops me. No one follows. Behind me, I hear my father's voice, smooth and controlled, now addressing his guests. Please, everyone, continue enjoying the evening. We apologize for the disruption. Family matters, you understand. As if I'm a minor inconvenience, a spilled drink to be mopped up and forgotten. In my bedroom, I pull a suitcase from my closet with shaking hands. What do you pack when your entire life is being taken away? I grab clothes randomly, not caring what they are. A few books. The jewelry my grandmother left me, my father can't take, that it was willed directly to me. Photographs of Sarah and me as children before she learned that reputation mattered more than loyalty. I move mechanically, numb my mind, unable to fully process what's happening. 57 minutes later, I'm walking down the same staircase, suitcase in hand. The party has resumed in a muted way, people speaking in hushed tones, pretending normalcy, while watching me from the corners of their eyes. My father stands near the front door with 2 security guards I've known my whole life. They won't meet my eyes. My mother is nowhere to be seen, but I know she's watching from somewhere upstairs. I can feel her gaze like ice on my back. Rain has started to fall, heavy and cold. No one offers me a coat. No one offers to call me a car. I step out into the storm and the massive oak door. The same door I walked through as a baby, as a child returning from school. As a teenager coming home from dates, closes behind me with a heavy final sound that echoes in my chest like a gunshot. I stand there in my expensive silk dress, now soaked and ruined, rain mixing with tears on my face, one suitcase at my feet, and a baby growing inside me that my family has decided doesn't exist. I look back at the glowing windows of the house at the party, continuing without me at the life I've been exiled from. And in that moment, standing alone in the rain, I realize something that will sustain me through everything that's coming. My father didn't lose a daughter tonight. He gave one away. And someday, he's going to wish he'd made a different choice. I spent that night in a cheap motel 6 miles from the estate, lying awake on scratchy sheets that smelled of bleach and strangers listening to rain hammer against a window that wouldn't quite close. Sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face contorted with rage, heard Sarah's voice declaring she couldn't be associated with my shame, felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching me walk toward my exile. My hand kept drifting to my stomach, to the tiny life growing there that had cost me everything I'd ever known. By the time weak morning light filtered through the stained curtains, I'd made a decision. I was keeping this baby, no matter what came next. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. My father's assistant speaking in the clipped professional tone reserved for business matters. Mr. Walsh requested my presence at his office at 10. Not a request, despite the polite phrasing. A summons. One final audience with the king before permanent banishment. I almost didn't go. Almost threw the phone across the room and drove in whatever direction the highway took me. But something pulled me back, maybe the foolish hope that he'd slept on it, reconsidered, remembered that I was his daughter before I was his disappointment. The security guard at the gate looked uncomfortable as he waved me through, unable to meet my eyes. I parked in the circular driveway where I'd learned to ride a bike, where my father had taught me to drive, where every major moment of my childhood had been photographed against the backdrop of the Walsh family fortress. Now it felt like approaching a castle where I was no longer welcome, where the drawbridge might rise at any moment and leave me stranded on the wrong side of the moat. My father's office occupied the entire west wing of the house, a domain of dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and furniture that cost more than most cars. The smell hit me as soon as I entered. Leather and cigars, the scent of power and old money. The smell I'd always associated with safety and paternal authority. Now it made my stomach turn. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, reviewing documents as if this were just another business transaction. Two other men in expensive suits flanked him, lawyers I realized, recognizing the older one from family events. This wasn't a conversation. It was a negotiation where only one side held any cards. "Sit," my father said without looking up, gesturing to the chair positioned deliberately lower than his own. I remained standing. He finally raised his eyes, and I saw no warmth there. No recognition of the 23 years we'd spent as father and daughter. Just cold calculation. "I'm giving you a choice, Jennifer. You can view this as mercy or as pragmatism, I don't particularly care which." He slid a document across the desk toward me. "Option 1, you terminate the pregnancy this week. I've already made arrangements with a private clinic, very discreet. You'll spend 6 months abroad, we'll call it a cultural enrichment program, studying art in Florence or some such thing. When you return, we'll find you a suitable husband, someone who understands that this incident never happened. You'll have access to your trust fund, maintain your position in the family, and we'll never speak of this again." The words landed like stones in my chest. He'd thought of everything, planned it all out like a corporate merger complete with contingency clauses and exit strategies. The lawyer handed me a pen. I didn't take it. "Option 2, my father continued, his voice hardening. "You keep the child, in which case you forfeit all inheritance, any claim to the Walsh name or resources. You'll sign documents releasing the family from any financial obligation to you or the bastard you're carrying. We'll have no contact. As far as this family and everyone we know is concerned, you'll cease to exist." "You can't be serious," I whispered. "I'm entirely serious. This is damage control, Jennifer. You've created a crisis, and I'm offering you a way out of it that preserves what matters, this family's reputation and future." He leaned back in his leather chair, studying me like I was a failing investment he was trying to salvage. "The father, he's gone, you said. So there's no one to object, no complications. You can walk away from this mistake and resume your life as if it never happened." That word, mistake? He was calling my baby, my child, a mistake to be erased, something that never happened. I looked at the documents, at the neat legal language that would reduce my pregnancy to a deleted line item in the Walsh family ledger, and I felt something shift inside me. Not just anger, but a fierce, protective clarity. "I'm keeping the baby," I said. My father's jaw tightened. "Then you're signing these papers and leaving. Today." He pushed a second set of documents toward me. "Read them if you'd like, though the terms are non-negotiable. You get nothing. No money, no connections, no help of any kind. You'll be completely on your own." I signed without reading. What did the specifics matter? I was already alone. The lawyer witnessed my signature with an expression of professional neutrality that must have taken years to perfect. My father stood the meeting concluded. "Someone will pack your remaining belongings and ship them wherever you designate. Don't contact your sister. Don't contact your mother. You made your choice." He walked to the window, turning his back to me in clear dismissal. "Goodbye, Jennifer." I walked toward the door on legs that felt disconnected from my body. As I reached for the handle, I heard my mother's voice in the hallway, soft and urgent. She was waiting just outside, and when I emerged, she pressed something into my hands, an envelope thick and heavy. "Take this," she whispered, glancing nervously toward my father's office. "Don't open it here. Just take it and go." Before I could respond, before I could ask any of the 1,000 questions crowding my throat, my father's voice called from inside. "Eleanor, is she gone?" My mother's face went pale. She squeezed my hand once hard, then disappeared down the hallway without another word, her heels clicking against marble in retreat. I stood there clutching the envelope, then shoved it into my bag, and walked through the front door one final time. The sky had darkened again. Storm clouds gathering like witnesses to my second exile in less than 24 hours. Thunder rolled across the estate as I climbed into my car, and by the time I reached the end of the long driveway, rain was falling in sheets so heavy I could barely see the road ahead. I pulled over a mile down the road, engine idling, and opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside 50 $100 bills, more money than I'd ever held at once. A letter in my mother's handwriting that I couldn't bring myself to read, yet the words blurred through my tears. And beneath it all, an old photograph creased and faded, showing my mother as a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, holding an infant. On the back, in handwriting I recognized as my grandmother's, were the words, 1978, my first daughter. I stared at that photograph, confused, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. My mother holding a baby in 1978. But I wasn't born until 1987. Sarah came in 1989. Who was this child? Why had I never seen this photo before? Why had my mother given it to me now at this moment with no explanation? I didn't know, then couldn't have known that photo held the key to my mother's guilt, and that letter would one day save my life. The $5,000 my mother gave me lasted exactly 3 months. 3 months of cheap motels that charged by the week of thrift store maternity clothes, that smelled like mothballs of generic prenatal vitamins, and fear that sat like a stone in my chest every time I checked my dwindling cash. By month 4, I was sleeping in my car in grocery store parking lots, waking every few hours, when security guards tapped on my window and told me to move along. The girl who'd once slept on Egyptian cotton sheets now curled up in a back seat with a jacket for a blanket, counting the days until her baby would be born into this nightmare she'd created. I found work at a diner called Rosie's on the edge of town, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since morning, regardless of what time you ordered it. The owner hired me despite my growing belly, maybe out of pity, maybe because I was desperate enough to work for minimum wage and accept whatever shifts no one else wanted. I worked doubles when I could get them standing for 12 hours straight until my ankles swelled and my lower back screamed. My hands, once soft and manicured for piano recitals and garden parties, became red and rough from industrial dish soap and scalding water. Customers called me sweetheart. Invoices dripping with condescension left me dollar tips on $20 checks and made comments about my situation that they thought I couldn't hear. I learned to eat 1 meal a day, usually whatever the kitchen was about to throw away at closing time. I learned which gas station bathrooms let you wash up without buying anything. I learned that shame has a smell. It's the mixture of yesterday's uniform and the cheapest soap you can find, and it follows you everywhere. But something strange happened in those months of survival. The soft parts of me that had always bent to my father's expectations, that had craved approval and feared judgment, began to calcify into something harder. The stares at my pregnant belly that once made me want to disappear started to feel like challenges I could meet with my head held high. I was still standing. That had to count for something. It was Margaret who found me. Or maybe I found her, though she always insisted it was fate. Her coffee shop sat on a quiet corner I passed every day, walking from the diner to wherever I'd parked my car that night. One evening in my 6th month, exhausted and dizzy from skipping lunch, I stopped to rest on the bench outside her shop. She brought me a cup of tea and a sandwich without asking if I wanted them, just set them beside me and said, "You look like you could use these." Margaret was perhaps mid-60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to see everything you weren't saying. Her face was weathered in the way that speaks of hardship survived rather than age, and when she smiled it reached those knowing eyes. "I'm Margaret," she said. "This is my place. Been here 30 years. She sat beside me while I ate, not asking questions, just existing in comfortable silence, like we'd known each other forever. A week later, I was cleaning tables in her shop when her wallet fell from her apron pocket. I picked it up, and through the clear plastic window meant for a driver's license, I saw a photograph that made my breath catch a young man, maybe 25, unmistakably my father. Younger, but those same sharp features, that same commanding presence, even in an old, faded photo. "That's Harold Walsh," I said before I could stop myself. Margaret looked at the wallet in my hands, and something flickered across her face too quick to name. "Old friend," she said quietly, taking the wallet back. "Very old." When I opened my mouth to ask more, she shook her head. "Some stories aren't ready to be told yet, honey." But the way she looked at me in that moment with recognition, with a kind of sad understanding, made my skin prickle with the sense that this wasn't coincidence. She offered me a job that same day and the tiny apartment above her shop that had been sitting empty since her last tenant moved out. "You need somewhere stable," she said simply. "Baby's coming soon. You need somewhere to land." I wanted to refuse to tell her I could manage on my own, but we both knew that was pride talking, and pride wasn't keeping me warm at night. Margaret taught me more than how to make coffee and balance a register. She taught me that forgiveness wasn't about letting people off the hook, it was about refusing to let their cruelty become your cage. "Grace is louder than revenge," she'd say while we cleaned up at closing time. "Anyone can hit back. It takes real strength to break the cycle to choose love when you've been taught hate." She never directly mentioned my family, but her words felt aimed at wounds she somehow knew I carried. One night, 8 months pregnant and folding dish towels, I asked her why she was helping me. She was quiet for a long time, staring out the dark window at the empty street. Finally she said, "They'll remember you someday, Jenny. Maybe not the way they expect." The certainty in her voice made me shiver. Years later, I'd learned Margaret saved me because saving me was saving herself. I went into labor on a Tuesday morning in March 3 weeks early while restocking sugar packets at Margaret's counter. My water broke in a rush that soaked through my jeans and pooled on the floor I'd just mopped. Margaret drove me to the county hospital with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping mine, telling me to breathe, that everything would be fine, while I bit down on my lip hard enough to taste blood and prayed she was right. 14 hours later, at 2 a.m, I held my son for the first time. He was tiny, barely 6 pounds, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through me into some place where all my fears lived. I named him Ethan, which means strong and firm, because I needed him to be both of those things in a world that already seemed determined to prove he was unwanted. The doctor came in an hour after birth with a face that told me something was wrong before he opened his mouth. Ethan had a heart murmur, he explained gently, likely a ventricular septal defect, a hole in the wall separating the heart's chambers. They'd need to monitor him closely, run tests, see if it would close on its own or require surgical intervention as he grew. The words washed over me like ice water. My baby, barely 3 hours old, already fighting a battle I couldn't fight for him. I looked down at Ethan sleeping in my arms, so small and vulnerable and perfect, and made a vow right there in that sterile hospital room with its beeping machines and antiseptic smell. I would protect this child with everything I had, every breath in my body, every hour of every day. He was mine and I was his, and nothing else mattered. Margaret let me keep the apartment above her shop rent-free those first months while I recovered. I took on 3 jobs, morning shifts at the coffee shop, afternoon cleaning houses for families who barely acknowledged my existence, evening data entry work I could do from my laptop while Ethan slept beside me. I survived on 4 hours of sleep and coffee strong enough to strip paint, but I never complained, never let myself think about the life I'd lost. This was my life now, night feedings and laundry hung to dry on a rack by the window, walks with a secondhand stroller through neighborhoods where no one knew my name or my story. Every sacrifice felt like an offering laid at the altar of my son's future. The years passed in a blur of developmental milestones and cardiology appointments. Ethan's heart defect didn't close on its own as we'd hoped. By the time he turned 8, the doctors were saying surgery couldn't be delayed any longer. His little body was working too hard, his heart struggling with every beat, and if we waited much longer, permanent damage would occur. The surgery would cost $150,000. I had $3,000 in savings built up painfully over 8 years of choosing between my needs and his. I applied for medical loans and was denied. I contacted every charity organization I could find and filled out forms until my hands cramped. Most never responded. The ones that did offered a few $100 drops in an ocean of debt I couldn't cross. I spent nights lying awake listening to Ethan breathe in the next room, each breath a reminder of what I stood to lose, and I wondered if this was my punishment for defying my family, for choosing my child over their approval. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. It was the hospital's billing department. A woman with a kind voice told me something I couldn't process at first. An anonymous benefactor had paid the full amount for Ethan's surgery. Every penny. All medical costs covered. I stood in Margaret's coffee shop with flour on my apron from the morning's baking, and my legs simply gave out. I sank to the floor right there behind the counter and sobbed huge, gasping cries of relief and confusion and gratitude for someone whose name I didn't even know. Margaret found me there, held me while I shook and whispered, "See, you're not as alone as you think." The surgery happened 2 weeks later. I held Ethan's hand until they wheeled him into the operating room, his small fingers gripping mine, his eyes wide with the trust only children have that their parents can keep them safe even when they can't. 4 hours later, the surgeon emerged to tell me it was successful. My son would live. My son would run and play and grow old. I pressed my face into my hands and thanked God and the universe and whoever that anonymous angel was who'd given my child a future I couldn't afford to buy. Ethan recovered slowly, spending 2 weeks in the hospital where I never left his side, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, reading him stories until my voice went hoarse. When we finally came home to our little apartment above the coffee shop, he was weak but healing, and I was grateful in ways I'd never been grateful before. We'd been given a second chance, a miracle we didn't deserve but received anyway. He grew into a gentle boy who asked questions about everything: why the sky changed colors, why some people had more than others, why kindness mattered when the world seemed so cruel. We'd cook simple meals together in our tiny kitchen, him standing on a chair to help stir pasta sauce, both of us laughing when flour ended up in our hair. We'd read under the single lamp in our living room, his head heavy on my shoulder, as I turned pages of library books we'd checked out that afternoon. These moments, small, quiet, ordinary, became my wealth. He was my redemption, the proof that love didn't need a mansion or a trust fund or a family name to be real. He was the reason I kept breathing, and they called him a mistake. Someone saved him when I couldn't. I never knew who until 15 years later when a letter revealed the truth. 15 years have a way of softening the sharpest edges of pain until you almost forget they were ever there. By 2025, I'd built something resembling peace. I was 38, manager of the coffee shop I'd renamed Margaret's Place after she passed in 2015, leaving me the business in a will that made me cry for 3 days straight. The shop had become more than a livelihood. It was a community hub where regulars knew each other's names, where single mothers found a safe place to bring their children, where I poured coffee and listened to stories, and sometimes when I caught my reflection in the espresso machine, recognized the woman I'd become. Ethan was 15 now, tall and lean with his father's dark hair and eyes that held a thoughtfulness that reminded me of no one but himself. He knew I had family somewhere, that we'd had differences, as I vaguely put it. But he'd never pressed for details, and I'd never offered them. Our life was small but full, and most days I went hours without thinking about the Walshes at all. The wound had scarred over into something I could live with, a dull ache I'd learned to carry like an old injury that only hurt when the weather changed. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in April, delivered with the regular mail between a utility bill and a flyer for pizza delivery. Thick, cream-colored paper, expensive weight, embossed with a crest I hadn't seen in 15 years, but recognized instantly, the Walsh family seal, that intricate W surrounded by flourishes that spoke of old money and older pride. My hands trembled as I opened it, and for a moment I was 23 again, standing in a ballroom watching my life shatter. Inside was exactly what I expected: Sarah's wedding invitation, formal script, announcing her marriage to someone named Bradley Thornton III at the Walsh estate in June. But there was something else too, a small card in my sister's handwriting attached with a paper clip. I read it once, then again, then a third time, because surely I'd misunderstood. "Jennifer, I hope you'll come celebrate with us. It would mean a lot, but please don't bring your boy. You understand." You understand. Those 2 words carried the weight of 15 years of silence of a family that had decided my son didn't exist because acknowledging him would mean acknowledging their cruelty. Sarah wanted me there as decoration, as proof that the Walsh family was magnanimous enough to forgive, but only if I left behind the evidence of my shame. Only if I pretended Ethan was something that could be hidden away like an embarrassing secret, rather than celebrated as the best thing that ever happened to me. I stood in my small office behind the coffee counter staring at that note and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger exactly, but a cold, clarifying fury that made my vision sharp and my thoughts even sharper. I pulled out a piece of Margaret's Place stationery, the simple cards with our logo of a coffee cup surrounded by small flowers that I used for thank you notes to suppliers and birthday cards for regular customers. I wrote 4 sentences in my neatest handwriting. Dear Sarah, thank you for thinking of us. We won't be attending. Wishing you happiness, Jennifer. I didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't beg for understanding or hurl accusations. The coldness in that courtesy felt more powerful than any angry letter I could have written. I sealed it, stamped it, and dropped it in the outgoing mail before I could second-guess myself. That evening, Ethan found me sitting at our small kitchen table, the invitation still in front of me, my untouched dinner growing cold. He was perceptive. My son always had been, and he read my face the way some people read books. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked, sliding into the chair across from me. I considered lying, painting on a smile, and changing the subject, but we'd built our relationship on honesty, even when the truth was complicated. I told him about the invitation, about Sarah's wedding, about the note that suggested he wasn't welcome at a family event because of who he was, how he came to be. I watched his face, carefully waiting for hurt or anger, but what I saw was something more complex, a kind of sad understanding that no 15-year-old should have to carry. "Why don't they want to meet me?" he asked quietly, not with the whine of a child denied something, but with genuine curiosity, as if trying to understand a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. I reached across the table and took his hand. This boy who'd grown from that fragile infant with a broken heart into someone stronger and kinder than anyone in my family had ever been. "Because they're afraid of how wonderful you are," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "Because seeing you knowing, you would mean admitting they were wrong about everything that mattered. And some people would rather hold on to their pride than reach for love." He nodded, slowly processing this, then squeezed my hand. "Their loss," he said with a slight smile that reminded me he was going to be just fine, that I'd raised him to understand his worth, wasn't determined by people who'd never bothered to know him. I didn't argue. I simply said we won't be attending. But silence, I'd learned, was just the beginning. The evening before Sarah's wedding, Ethan and I were cleaning up the coffee shop after closing, wiping down tables and stacking chairs in the comfortable rhythm we'd developed over years of working side by side. He was quiet, thoughtful in that way he got when something was bothering him, but he wasn't sure how to voice it. Finally, as I was counting the register, he said, "Mom, why didn't we send anything?" I looked up from the bills in my hands, confused. "To the wedding," he clarified. "I know we're not going, but shouldn't we at least acknowledge it? Send a card or something?" His question was innocent, genuinely curious rather than accusatory, but it stopped me cold. He was right in a way I hadn't considered. My silence, my absence could be read as bitterness, as if I was still the wounded 23-year-old nursing grudges. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory, one of those lessons she'd repeated so often it had become part of my internal compass. Grace is louder than silence. I thought about it all night, lying awake in the small bedroom of our apartment above the shop, listening to the occasional car pass on the street below. By morning, I'd made a decision. I called the nicest florist in town, the one that handled arrangements for the country club set, and ordered a bouquet of white orchids. Not roses, which would be expected and forgettable. Orchids, expensive, elegant, impossible to ignore. The kind of flowers that spoke of taste and deliberation, that said I'd put thought into this gesture. The florist asked what I wanted on the card, and I wrote, carefully editing in my head until the words felt right. "From the daughter you forgot and the grandson you never met. Wishing you happiness. Damnams." I gave her the Walsh estate address arranged for delivery at 2 in the afternoon when guests would be arriving, and paid with a credit card I rarely used because the amount made me wince. But it felt important, this gesture. Not for them, but for me. For Ethan. To prove we existed, we mattered. We could extend grace even when none had been shown to us. I didn't attend the wedding, didn't drive past the estate or think about what was happening there. Instead, Ethan and I spent the day at the small lake outside town, renting a canoe and paddling across water. So still it reflected clouds like a mirror. We packed sandwiches and chips, swam in the cold water until our lips turned blue, lay on the rocky beach, letting sun dry the goosebumps from our skin. It was a perfect day, the kind that reminds you that happiness doesn't require invitations to places you were never meant to belong. I didn't think about Sarah or the flowers or any of it. I was present fully in the life I'd built rather than the one I'd lost. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known because I'd never created a social media account, never scrolled through Facebook or Instagram or whatever platforms people use to document their lives, was that my orchids had arrived exactly as planned, carried into the reception venue by a delivery person who left them on the gift table where everyone could see. I didn't know that Sarah, 3 glasses of champagne deep and surrounded by her bridesmaids in a private room while makeup artists touched up her face, had been told about the flowers by a cousin who thought it was sweet romantic, even that the estranged sister had sent such an elegant arrangement. I didn't know that Sarah's face had gone white, then red, that she'd marched out to the gift table in her wedding dress train dragging behind her and snatched the card with hands that shook with rage. I didn't see her read it aloud to the bridesmaids who'd followed her, her voice rising with each word until she was nearly shouting. I didn't hear her say, "How dare that whore show up in my life again even like this? She ruins everything she touches." I didn't watch her tear the card into pieces, then grab the orchids and throw them toward a trash can, expensive white petals scattering across the polished floor like snow. And I certainly didn't see the bridesmaid's cousin, a college girl with her phone always in hand recording the entire meltdown from 20 feet away, her eyes wide with shock and something like glee at witnessing such spectacular drama. The video was posted before the ceremony even started, uploaded to TikTok with the caption, "When a bride forgets grace at her own wedding." It showed everything. Sarah's face twisted with anger, her words about the whore sister, the violent destruction of flowers that clearly represented an attempt at reconciliation, the way her bridesmaids looked at each other with uncomfortable expressions, that said they knew this was wrong, but didn't dare intervene. By the time Sarah walked down the aisle 3 hours later, the video had 17,000 views. By the time she cut the cake, it had 200,000. By the time she left for her honeymoon the next morning, it had gone viral with over 2 million views and climbing, shared across every platform with comments that ranged from shocked to scathing. Imagine being so cruel you destroy flowers from your own sister. The sister sent orchids, and she called her a whore and threw them away, at her own wedding. This is why some families deserve to be cut off. That poor sister and her son, they're better off without these people. The comments went on and on, thousands of strangers weighing in on a family drama they knew nothing about, but recognized instinctively as wrong. The groom's family, prominent in their own social circles, was mortified. Bradley's mother called Eleanor the morning after the wedding, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, saying this kind of public scandal was not what their family associated with that. Perhaps they'd rushed into this union without properly understanding what kind of people the Walshes really were. Harold saw the video when a business associate texted it to him with just a question mark, no other commentary needed. He watched his younger daughter's meltdown, watched her destroy a gesture of grace, watched her reveal the cruelty that had been hidden behind expensive clothes and polished manners, and he exploded. He called my old phone number, which had long been disconnected. He called Margaret's place, but I'd turned off the shop phone for the weekend. His rage had nowhere to land except back on himself, which only made it worse. He blamed me anyway, told Eleanor that somehow I'd orchestrated this, that I'd sent those flowers knowing Sarah would react poorly, that I'd probably arranged for someone to film it. Eleanor listened to his ranting from the doorway of his study, her face unreadable. Later that night, alone in her bedroom, Eleanor watched the video on her tablet with the sound turned low. She watched it 3 times, studying her younger daughter's face, the ugliness that surfaced so easily when Sarah thought no one important was watching. She thought about the orchids, about the message on that card, about the daughter who'd extended grace after 15 years of silence and the daughter who'd responded with violence and venom. For the first time in 15 years, Eleanor felt something crack in the careful facade she'd maintained, the story she'd told herself about having made the right choice, the necessary choice. She saw clearly, perhaps for the first time, that they hadn't just lost Jennifer. They'd lost their way entirely. The shame that settled over her that night was different from the shame she'd felt at Jennifer's pregnancy announcement. This shame had nowhere to hide, no reputation to blame it on. This was just the mirror finally showing her the truth. They thought the flowers were my revenge. They had no idea I never even watched what happened next. Karma, it turned out, didn't need my help. I never saw the video of Sarah's meltdown, never knew it existed until months later when a regular customer mentioned it casually while ordering her latte, assuming I'd been part of the internet spectacle. By then, it didn't matter. I'd moved on, or so I thought, until November 2026, when an idea took root that felt both generous and quietly strategic. I'd been volunteering at the community center for years, serving meals to people who knew what it meant to be forgotten by the world. And it occurred to me that Christmas was approaching, a season supposedly about family and grace. Though my own family had taught me it was more often about exclusion and judgment. What if I hosted something real? Something that mattered? A Christmas dinner for people who had nowhere else to go. Homeless families, single mothers like I'd once been, foster children, aging out of the system. Elderly folks whose families had stopped calling. And what if in that space of genuine compassion, I invited the Walshes to witness what grace actually looked like? I spent 2 weeks planning every detail, rented the community center for Christmas Eve, arranged for donated food from local restaurants whose owners remembered me serving them coffee every morning for years, organized volunteers to help cook and serve. Then I designed the invitations on heavy cardstock, simple but elegant, with a wreath border, and words I chose carefully. You are invited to Christmas for the Forgotten, a celebration for those who still believe in the meaning of family. December 24th, 6 p.m., Riverside Community Center. I sent them to everyone on the guest list, which included 40 people I knew needed a warm meal and a place to belong. And then, with my heart beating hard enough to hurt, I addressed 3 more envelopes in my neatest handwriting: Harold and Eleanor Walsh, Sarah and Bradley Thornton, and 2 other relatives who'd been at that birthday party 16 years ago when my life split in 2. The subtext of that invitation was impossible to miss for anyone paying attention. What did it mean to be forgotten, and who in that room had done the forgetting? Ethan was 16, now taller than me by 3 inches, with his father's sharp features softened by a kindness I liked to think came from me, or at least from the life we'd built together. He threw himself into preparations with an enthusiasm that made my chest ache with pride. We spent evenings after the coffee shop closed, stringing lights across the community center's ceiling, arranging round tables with donated tablecloths and centerpieces made from pine cones and candles. He assembled gift bags for the children who'd be attending, filling them with small toys and books I'd collected throughout the year. One evening while we worked, he asked the question I'd been expecting. Mom, what if they don't come? Your family, I mean. I was hanging a strand of white lights and paused to look at him, this boy who'd grown into someone I admired more than he knew. They will, I said with certainty I actually felt. Pride always needs an audience. I watched understanding dawn on his face, that moment when he realized this wasn't just about serving dinner to people in need. This was something more layered, more complex. His mother, who'd been teaching him about grace and forgiveness his entire life, was demonstrating that those virtues didn't mean being a doormat. They meant creating spaces where truth became unavoidable, where people had to confront what they'd done simply by witnessing what could have been. You're kind of brilliant, you know that, he said, grinning. I learned from the best, I replied, thinking of Margaret and her cryptic wisdom about breaking cycles, about how the most powerful revenge was living well enough that your enemies had to watch you thrive. Meanwhile, across town in the Walsh mansion, Harold stared at the cream-colored invitation on his desk with the kind of anger that had become his default setting since the wedding video made them a laughingstock in their social circle. "She's mocking us," he said to Eleanor, who stood by the window, watching snow fall across their manicured lawn. "Christmas for the forgotten. It's a direct attack telling the world we forgot her." Eleanor turned slowly, and something in her face had shifted over the past months, a weariness that makeup couldn't quite hide. "If we don't attend, people will talk," she said quietly. "After Sarah's video, we can't afford another scandal. Can you imagine what people would say if they learned we were invited to our own daughter's charity event and refused to show up?" Sarah, summoned to her parents' house to discuss what Eleanor called the situation, sat in the living room with her arms crossed, her marriage already showing cracks after just 18 months. Bradley's family had never quite forgiven the viral incident, and the tension in their home had become something you could cut with a knife. "I'm not going," Sarah said flatly. "I won't give her the satisfaction." "You'll go," Harold said, his voice hard. "We'll all go. We'll show our faces, smile for whoever might be watching, and prove that we're gracious enough to support her little charity project. We'll turn it around, make it look like we're the bigger people." He stood and paced, already strategizing like this was a business deal he could win through careful positioning. "We wear our best. We're polite. We stay an hour, make a donation that looks generous, and leave. We control the narrative." Eleanor said nothing, but something in her eyes suggested she knew that narratives couldn't be controlled when truth was sitting at every table, visible in every face of every person who'd been genuinely forgotten while the Walshes had simply chosen to forget. They would attend, she knew, but not because they wanted reconciliation. They would come because their pride demanded it, because being seen as cruel was worse than actually being cruel. They would dress in their expensive clothes, rehearse their polite smiles, and walk into that community center as if they were doing Jennifer a favor, rather than facing a reckoning they didn't yet understand was coming. They came not in forgiveness, but in fear. Dressed in pride, they walked into a room that would strip it all away. They arrived at 6:15, fashionably late even to a charity dinner, and I watched from across the room as they stepped through the community center doors in a cluster of expensive wool coats and practiced expressions of benevolence. Harold wore a cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than most of our guests earned in 3 months. Eleanor had on pearls and that particular shade of camel-colored coat that screamed old money. Sarah clung to Bradley's arm like she needed his support to remain upright, her face already showing the tightness of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. But what stopped them all in the doorway, what made Harold's confident stride falter for just a moment, was the reality of the room they'd entered. This wasn't the small, controlled gathering they'd imagined, where they could make a brief appearance and leave. The community center was full, maybe 70 people filling round tables decorated with our humble pine cone centerpieces, children running between chairs shrieking with laughter, elderly folks in threadbare sweaters sharing stories over cups of coffee, young mothers bouncing babies on their hips while volunteers brought plates of food from the kitchen. These were the people the Walshes had spent their entire lives avoiding, the ones they drove past without seeing the messy reality of struggle and survival that their wealth insulated them from. I saw Harold's nose wrinkle slightly, that unconscious gesture of distaste he'd probably spent years perfecting. Sarah leaned into Bradley and whispered something that made him squeeze her hand in what looked like reassurance or warning. But Eleanor stood very still, her eyes moving slowly across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read from where I stood. I took a breath, smoothed my simple red sweater, and walked toward them with Ethan at my side. Every head in the room seemed to turn, sensing something significant in this moment, even if they didn't understand the details. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice warm and genuine because hospitality had become my armor over the years. "It means so much that you're here to support this community." I was gracious, impeccable in my courtesy, and I saw Harold's jaw tighten, because he couldn't respond with anything less than civility without looking like exactly the kind of person that viral video had suggested he raised. He managed a stiff nod. Eleanor's eyes met mine and held them for a beat too long, something swimming in their depths that might have been regret or recognition or both. "This is quite the turnout," Harold said, his tone suggesting he'd expected something more manageable, more controllable. "We're blessed," I replied simply. "These are all people who understand what family really means, the one you choose, not just the one you're born into." The subtle barb landed. I saw it register in Sarah's flinch. "Let me show you around," I continued, gesturing toward the far wall. "We've put together something special." I led them through the crowded room, Ethan walking beside me with a quiet confidence that made my heart swell. People nodded at us, smiled a few, called out greetings that I returned. The Walshes followed like dignitaries on a tour of foreign territory, maintaining careful distance from anyone who might brush against their expensive clothes. We stopped in front of the wall I'd spent days preparing, and I watched their faces as understanding slowly dawned. The wall was covered in photographs, dozens of them in mismatched frames I'd collected from thrift stores and spray-painted gold. At first glance, it looked like a community photo wall, the kind you might see celebrating a neighborhood's history. But every single image was of Ethan and me. There was the hospital photo from the day he was born, me exhausted and radiant, holding my tiny son, both of us alone, but together. Ethan's first birthday in our cramped apartment above Margaret's shop, his face covered in chocolate cake. His first day of kindergarten, standing on our doorstep in an oversized backpack, grinning with missing front teeth. Halloween costumes made from bed sheets and cardboard. Christmas mornings with a small tree and fewer presents than other kids got, but his joy blazing in every frame. Soccer games where I was the only parent cheering from folding chairs. Middle school science fairs. High school honor society ceremonies. Beach trips where we built sandcastles. Quiet evenings reading together on our worn couch. Birthday after birthday after birthday, year after year of a life fully lived and documented, a childhood full of love, even in the absence of wealth. The centerpiece. The largest frame, mounted in the exact center of the wall, held a photo from this past summer. Ethan and me at his 16th birthday dinner at our favorite cheap Italian restaurant. Both of us laughing at something the waiter had said, his arm around my shoulders. Beneath it, a small placard read, "A family portrait, no wedding needed." The silence that fell over our little group was absolute. I didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't need to. The weight of 15 years pressed down on all of us, visible in every image of every moment they'd missed, every milestone they'd rejected by rejecting us. Harold stood frozen, his face the color of old newspaper, staring at his grandson's progression from infant to young man, a life that had happened entirely without him. His lips moved soundlessly, as if he was trying to count the years, or calculate what had been lost, and finding the math impossible. Eleanor's hand reached out trembling, and her fingers touched the edge of the frame holding Ethan's kindergarten photo. A small sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a sob, quickly stifled. Tears slipped down her cheeks, cutting through expensive makeup, and she didn't bother wiping them away. She was seeing, perhaps for the first time, exactly what her silence had cost. Not abstract concepts like family or legacy, but this specific boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined chin, this grandson who existed in all these moments she'd been too afraid to witness. Sarah turned away sharply, her hand covering her mouth, unable or unwilling to look at the evidence of the life she'd dismissed with a single line on a wedding invitation. Bradley stood awkwardly beside her, clearly understanding he was witnessing something private and painful that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the family he'd married into. Other guests had started to notice the photographs, drifting closer with curiosity and warm smiles, not knowing the drama unfolding, but responding to the obvious love captured in every frame. An elderly woman touched my arm gently and said, "What a beautiful son you have, dear. You must be so proud." I thanked her, my voice steady, while the Walshes stood trapped in the web of their own choices made visible. Harold finally found his voice barely a whisper, his eyes still locked on the wall. "What have we done?" The question hung in the air between us, rhetorical and devastating. Eleanor closed her eyes as if the answer was too painful to witness. Sarah's shoulders shook with silent tears that seemed more about self-pity than genuine remorse. When my father saw that wall, he whispered those words. But the question came 15 years too late. Dinner passed in a blur of conversations and laughter. The community center filled with the warm chaos of people genuinely enjoying themselves, finding connection in shared stories of hardship and survival. I moved through the room, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, catching glimpses of the Walshes at their corner table, where they sat like mannequins at a department store present, but not participating, their discomfort radiating outward in waves. As dessert was being served, donated pies from the local bakery, nothing fancy but made with care. One of the volunteers approached me with the portable microphone we'd rented for the evening. "Jennifer, would you say a few words? People would love to hear from you." I hadn't planned on speaking, had thought the photo wall would say everything that needed saying, but as I took the microphone and walked to the front of the room, I realized this was the moment everything had been building toward. The room quieted as I stood there, and I was suddenly aware of every eye on me, including the 3 pairs that belonged to my family. I wasn't nervous. I'd spent 16 years learning to stand in my truth without apology, and that confidence settled over me like a familiar coat. "Thank you all for being here tonight." I began, my voice steady and clear. "This gathering isn't about me, but it is about something I've learned through the hardest years of my life, that love doesn't require permission." I paused, letting those words sink in. We're taught from childhood that family is the people we're born to, that blood creates obligation and loyalty. But I've learned that family is something deeper, something chosen. It's the people who show up when you need them. It's the hands that reach out when you're falling. It's the voices that say you matter when the world has told you that you don't. I could feel the Walshes' stares like physical weight, but I didn't look at them. I spoke to the single mothers at table 3 who nodded with understanding that came from experience. I spoke to the foster kids at table 5 who'd been passed between homes like unwanted furniture. I spoke to the elderly man by the window who'd told me earlier his children hadn't called in 2 years. Tonight we gather to remember that grace is the most powerful form of strength, not the grace that excuses cruelty or pretends hurt didn't happen, but the grace that says, "I will not let what you did to me determine who I become." The grace that chooses kindness when bitterness would be easier. The grace that builds something beautiful from the ashes of what was destroyed. My voice never wavered, never cracked with emotion, though I felt it rising in my chest. Some of you in this room tonight have been told your mistakes, that you're shameful, that you're not enough. I want you to know that the people who said those things were wrong. You are not defined by the circumstances of your birth, by the mistakes others made, or by the families who failed to see your worth. You are defined by how you choose to live, how you choose to love, and whether you choose to pass on the pain you received or to break the cycle and create something better. I finally allowed myself to glance at my family's table. Harold sat completely still, his face drained of its usual confidence and authority, looking suddenly old and small despite his expensive suit. The arrogance that had defined him my entire life had crumbled into something that looked almost like comprehension, the dawning horror of understanding who his daughter had become in his absence. Someone stronger, kinder, more whole than he'd ever been. Eleanor wasn't even trying to hide her tears anymore. Her hands covered her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs she'd probably been holding back for 16 years, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she'd done, what she'd allowed to be done. Sarah stared at me with an expression so complex I couldn't parse all its elements: envy mixed with shame, admiration twisted with resentment, The look of someone realizing they'd bet on the wrong horse and lost everything that mattered in the process. The other guests didn't know they were witnessing a family reckoning. They just heard words that resonated with their own experiences of rejection and survival. And when I finished speaking, the applause started slowly, and then built until the entire room was standing clapping not just for my speech but for something larger, for the possibility of redemption, for the proof that you could be thrown away and still build a life worth living. I returned to my seat beside Ethan, my hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, and he immediately reached over and took my hand in his, holding it tightly in both of his own. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I saw everything in his eyes, pride, understanding, love so fierce it made my throat tight. In that moment, I knew he'd grasped the full scope of what had happened tonight, what had been happening his entire life. He understood that I'd turned exile into empowerment, that I'd transformed shame into strength, that I'd taken abandonment and built autonomy from its wreckage. He understood that real power had nothing to do with making others suffer and everything to do with refusing to let their cruelty define the shape of your soul. We sat there together, mother and son, hands clasped as the applause continued around us, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 16 years. Not vindication exactly, but completion. The story I'd been telling with my life had reached a chapter ending, and what came next would be written by both of us together. That night, after we'd cleaned up the community center and driven home through streets decorated with Christmas lights, Ethan found the letter she'd hidden from him for 16 years. What he read would change everything he thought he knew about forgiveness. I fell asleep that night easier than I had in weeks, the tension I'd been carrying finally released into the universe. But Ethan couldn't sleep. I heard him moving around in his room past midnight, the creak of floorboards I'd learned to recognize over years of late-night studying and teenage restlessness. I almost got up to check on him, but something told me to let him be, that whatever he was processing needed space and solitude. What I didn't know was that he'd gone to my closet, to the old cardboard box I kept on the top shelf, where I stored things too precious to use but too meaningful to discard. Hospital bracelets from his birth, his first pair of shoes, report cards, birthday cards he'd made me with crayon drawings and misspelled declarations of love, and buried beneath all of it in an envelope I'd tucked away 16 years ago, and never looked at again, was my mother's letter. Ethan told me later, months after everything that followed, exactly what happened that night. He'd been thinking about the photo wall, about his grandmother's tears, about the way his grandfather had whispered those 4 words. What have we done? And he'd wanted to understand where he came from, what his history was beyond the simplified version I'd always given him about family differences and irreconcilable values. He'd pulled down the memory box carefully, sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by the artifacts of our shared life, and worked his way through each item like an archaeologist, uncovering layers of time. The envelope was at the very bottom, yellowed with age, my name written across the front in handwriting he didn't recognize, but somehow knew belonged to Eleanor. His hands shook as he opened it, unfolding paper that had been sealed away for nearly as long as he'd been alive. The letter was dated the night I was exiled, written in script that wavered and blurred in places where tears had fallen. Jennifer, it began, and Ethan said later that even those 2 syllables carried a weight of anguish he could feel through the years. I am a coward. I should have defended you tonight. I should have stood between you and your father, but I was too afraid of his anger, afraid of losing everything I've built my life around, afraid of what people would say. I failed you as your mother in the moment you needed me most. I know these words can't undo what happened, can't change the fact that I watched him throw you out and said nothing, did nothing, except slip you money, like that could somehow absolve me of my silence. Ethan read on his chest, tightening with each line. I pray every night for you and for the baby boy you're carrying. I hope he's healthy. I hope he grows up knowing love. Real love, not the conditional kind your father and I offered you. I've set up a fund completely anonymous through lawyers who won't trace it back to me for his medical needs. It's not nearly enough, I know that. It doesn't make up for what I've taken from you. But it's the least I can do, the only thing I can do without your father finding out and stopping me. Please don't hate me more than I already hate myself. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I just need you to know that my silence wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I loved myself more, loved my comfort and my status and my life without conflict. I was weak. I am weak. And you're stronger than I'll ever be. Your mother, Eleanor. Ethan read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of pain and regret embedded in those carefully chosen words. Tears streamed down his face, and he said later he wasn't even sure who he was crying for. His mother who'd been abandoned, his grandmother who'd been too broken to be brave, or himself caught in the middle of a tragedy that had shaped his entire existence before he was even born. But it was the line about the medical fund that made everything inside him go still and cold, and then suddenly blazingly clear. An anonymous fund for medical needs. Anonymous. He remembered being 8 years old, small for his age, and getting tired too easily the way his chest would hurt when he ran too hard during recess. He remembered his mother taking him to the cardiologist. The serious faces of doctors explaining that his heart condition had worsened, that surgery was now necessary, not optional, that without it, the defect would cause permanent damage, or worse. He remembered his mother's face when they gave her the estimate $150,000, and how all the color had drained from it. He remembered her trying to hide her panic, telling him everything would be fine, while her hands shook as she filled out financial aid applications that kept getting denied. And then he remembered the phone call that changed everything. His mother answering, then going very quiet, then slowly sinking to her knees in the kitchen while he watched from the doorway, confused and scared. When she hung up, she'd been crying but also laughing, this strange combination of relief and disbelief. "Someone paid for your surgery," she'd told him, pulling him into her arms. "An anonymous donor paid for everything. You're going to be okay, baby. You're going to be okay." He'd asked who it was, and she'd said she didn't know, that the hospital couldn't tell her, that it was someone who wanted to remain nameless. They'd speculated together sometimes over the years maybe it was Margaret, though she didn't have that kind of money. Maybe it was some charity program they'd forgotten applying to. Maybe it was just luck, grace, the universe balancing scales. But it wasn't luck. It wasn't grace. It was Eleanor. His grandmother, who'd helped cast him out before he was born, had saved his life when he was 8 years old. The woman who'd been too afraid to defend his mother had somehow found the courage to defend him secretly from a distance without ever asking for credit or recognition. The complexity of it overwhelmed Ethan in waves. Anger that she'd abandoned his mother, but gratitude that she'd saved him. Resentment at her weakness, but understanding of her limitations. Grief for the relationship they might have had if she'd been braver, and compassion for the prison of fear she'd built around herself. He sat on my bedroom floor until 3 a.m, letter in his hands, piecing together a more nuanced version of his family history. Eleanor wasn't a monster. She was just a person flawed and frightened, trapped between the life she'd been taught to want and the love she didn't know how to choose. His grandfather Harold was cruel, yes, but maybe he was also operating from his own wounds, his own fears about reputation and control. Even Sarah tearing up flowers at her wedding was probably just scared of being associated with the kind of exile she'd seen destroy her sister. Hurt people hurt people. Broken people break others. But also, and this was what shifted something fundamental in Ethan's understanding, broken people sometimes tried to fix things in the only ways they knew how, even if those ways were inadequate, even if they came too late. He thought about his mother's speech that evening, about grace being the most powerful form of strength, about breaking cycles instead of perpetuating them. And he realized that forgiveness wasn't about saying what someone did was okay. It was about refusing to let their failures poison your future. It was about seeing their humanity even when they couldn't see yours. It was about being brave enough to end the cycle of hurt, to say, "It stops with me," even when you had every right to pass that pain forward. He whispered into the darkness of my bedroom, "Maybe forgiveness isn't weakness. Maybe it's the real payback." and the words felt true in a way that settled deep in his bones. He carefully folded the letter back into its envelope, placed it back at the bottom of the memory box, exactly where he'd found it, and returned the box to my closet shelf. He didn't wake me. Didn't tell me what he'd discovered. Years later, he explained that he wanted to protect me from having to decide how to feel about Eleanor's secret kindness, that he wanted to spare me the complexity of gratitude mixed with betrayal. But I think part of him also needed time to figure out what this revelation meant for his own future, his own choices about who to become, and how to respond to the legacy of pain our family had created. He said those words about forgiveness being the real payback. I wasn't ready to agree, not yet. But my son understood something I was still learning. The morning after the Christmas dinner, I woke feeling strangely hollow, as if some essential part of me that had been clenched tight for 16 years had finally unclenched and left an empty space behind. I made coffee in the quiet of our apartment, watched weak winter sunlight filter through the kitchen window, and tried to understand what I was feeling. Not triumph, though the night had gone better than I could have imagined. Not satisfaction, though the Walshes had finally seen what they'd thrown away. Just a kind of tired peace, the exhaustion that comes after carrying something heavy for so long you've forgotten what your arms feel like without the weight. I didn't know that while I stood there in my bathrobe sipping coffee, my words from the night before were being shared across platforms I'd never joined, spreading like ripples across water I couldn't see. Someone at the dinner, I never learned who had recorded my speech on their phone. Not the whole evening, just those few minutes when I stood at the front of the room talking about love and permission and grace. They'd posted it somewhere, maybe Facebook or Instagram or one of those other digital spaces I deliberately avoided because I had no interest in performing my life for strangers. But the video found its audience anyway. By noon on Christmas Day, it had been viewed 50,000 times. By evening, 500,000. People shared it with captions like, "This is what strength looks like," and "Every single mother needs to hear this," and "Her family should be ashamed." The comments section filled with stories from other exiled daughters, other single mothers, other people who'd been called mistakes and spent their lives proving otherwise. Someone pieced together the backstory from Sarah's wedding video that had gone viral earlier that year, connecting dots between the sister who'd torn up flowers and the woman now speaking about grace. Articles appeared on parenting blogs and inspiration websites, analyzing the subtext of my words, praising what they called my quiet dignity, and speculating about the family drama that lay beneath. The Walsh name got mentioned repeatedly, always in contexts that made them look small and cruel next to my apparent nobility. Harold's business associates sent him links with subject lines like, "Is this your daughter?" Eleanor's charity board friends called to ask if she'd seen that video going around. Sarah, scrolling through her phone on Christmas morning while Bradley's family exchanged gifts in the other room, watched her sister's speech with a sick feeling in her stomach, reading comment after comment that praised Jennifer while implicitly condemning everyone who'd hurt her. The family's reputation, already damaged by one viral video, took another public hit. But I knew none of this. I spent Christmas Day the way I always did, working the morning shift at Margaret's place, because we stayed open for people who had nowhere else to go on holidays, then coming home to make dinner with Ethan, watching movies on our old couch, existing in the small real life I'd built far from the noise of public opinion. It was Ethan who showed me what he'd created a few days after Christmas when I walked into his room to ask if he wanted pizza for dinner. He was standing on his desk chair, hammer in hand, hanging something on the wall above his bed. When I saw what it was, I stopped in the doorway, my throat suddenly tight. He'd taken one of the photos from Christmas night, me at the microphone, caught mid-sentence, surrounded by faces turned toward me with attention and respect, and had it printed and professionally framed. Below the image, he'd added a small plaque with words engraved in simple script, December 2026, the night Mom set herself free. "Ethan," I whispered, because full sentences felt impossible. He climbed down from the chair and turned to face me, his expression serious and tender, in that way only teenage boys who've learned empathy can manage. "You didn't look angry up there, Mom," he said quietly. "You looked free, like you'd been carrying something really heavy and finally put it down." I walked into his room and stood before the photo, seeing myself through his eyes. Not bitter, not vengeful, just present and powerful in a way I'd never quite managed to be before that night. He was right. The revenge I'd thought I wanted, the satisfaction of making them hurt the way they'd hurt me, turned out to be unnecessary. Living well, loving, fully refusing to be diminished by their cruelty, that was the victory. That had always been the victory. I pulled my son into a hug and cried against his shoulder while he held me, roles reversed for just a moment. The child comforting the parent who'd spent 16 years being strong enough for both of them. Meanwhile, across town in the mansion that had never quite felt like a home, Eleanor sat alone in her study on the day after Christmas, while Harold played golf and Sarah and Bradley returned to their own strained household. She'd spent the morning doing what she'd sworn she wouldn't do, searching for her daughter's name online, finding the video, watching it over and over until she'd memorized every word, every gesture, every moment of grace Jennifer had shown. She read the comments, hundreds of them, thousands of them. People calling her daughter incredible, calling her family cruel, piecing together a narrative that was more accurate than Eleanor wanted to admit. The daughter she'd thrown away had become a woman of profound grace and quiet power, while Eleanor remained trapped in a hollow mansion with a man who valued reputation over humanity, who saw people as assets or liabilities rather than souls worthy of love. Something broke in Eleanor that morning, some final pretense that she'd made the right choice, that protecting the family name had been worth the cost. She opened her laptop and spent 3 hours researching how to establish a scholarship fund, how to make donations anonymously, how to do something meaningful with the money she'd inherited from her own mother and never quite known what to do with. By evening, she'd set up the Silent Grace Fund, a scholarship program for children of single mothers pursuing higher education with particular preference given to those who'd overcome medical hardships. She donated $200,000 as the founding contribution, more money than she'd spent on anything in years that wasn't jewelry or furniture or maintaining appearances. She didn't publicize it, didn't tell Harold, who would have questioned why she was giving away his money even though it was legally hers. Didn't seek credit or recognition. It was her private penance, inadequate and late but genuine, a small attempt to balance scales that could never truly be balanced. Only she knew it was inspired by Jennifer, by the speech about grace and love not needing permission, by the crushing realization that her daughter had figured out how to be the kind of person Eleanor had always pretended to be. The next morning, a letter arrived at my door, thick paper embossed with our family crest. I hadn't seen that seal in 16 years. I stood on my doorstep, holding the envelope, that familiar crest embossed in gold, and for a moment I considered not opening it at all, just tossing it in the recycling bin and pretending it had never arrived. But Ethan saw me standing there frozen and said gently, "Mom, whatever it is, you can handle it." And his faith in me was enough to make my fingers work the seal open. Inside was a single sheet of Eleanor's personal stationery, her handwriting more shaky than I remembered, as if she'd written it multiple times before settling on these particular words. "Jennifer, I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to have something that belongs to you, our cabin at Lake Tahoe. It was always your favorite place as a child. I've had it maintained all these years. The key is enclosed. Go there when you're ready. There are things I've kept for you. I won't bother you again. Mother." Taped to the bottom of the page was a small silver key, the kind that opens old-fashioned locks worn smooth from years of use. Lake Tahoe. The words alone opened a floodgate of memories I'd carefully sealed away, summers running barefoot on wooden docks, the smell of pine and clean water, my father teaching me to skip stones, while my mother read on the porch, Sarah and I building elaborate sandcastles that the small waves would eventually claim. It had been our family's sanctuary, the place where Harold's business stress seemed to melt away, and Eleanor actually laughed instead of just smiling politely. I'd loved that cabin with the fierce, uncomplicated love children have for places where they feel safe. I stared at the key for 3 days, carrying it in my pocket, taking it out to look at during quiet moments at the coffee shop, asking myself what Eleanor could possibly have kept for me and whether I wanted to know the answer. On the fourth day, I told Ethan I needed to take a drive, clear my head, spend some time alone. He didn't ask where I was going, just hugged me and said, "Take your time, Mom. I'll hold down the fort." The drive to Tahoe took 4 hours through mountain passes dusted with early snow, the landscape shifting from city to forest in a way that felt like traveling backward through time. When I finally pulled up the long gravel driveway and saw the cabin exactly as I remembered it, weathered cedar shingles, green shutters, the porch swing still hanging from its chains, something inside me cracked. This place had been preserved like a museum exhibit of my childhood, maintained for a daughter who was supposed to no longer exist. I used the key Eleanor had sent, and it turned smoothly in the lock as if it had been recently oiled. Inside, everything was clean, dust-free, clearly tended to regularly, even though no one had lived here. The furniture was the same down to the faded quilt on the couch and the chipped coffee mugs hanging in the kitchen. I walked through rooms filled with ghosts of who we'd been before everything broke, and with each step the weight in my chest grew heavier. In the master bedroom, the one that had belonged to my parents, I found the old cedar chest at the foot of the bed. I almost didn't open it, afraid of what confronting more memories might cost me, but I'd come all this way and turning back felt like cowardice. The chest was full of photographs, not just a few but hundreds of them organized chronologically in albums with dates written in Eleanor's careful script. Every photo of me that I'd assumed had been destroyed or thrown away after my exile was here. Baby pictures, birthday parties, school photos with missing teeth and bad haircuts, prom in a dress I'd loved, high school graduation in my cap and gown. My entire childhood and adolescence preserved like evidence of something that mattered. But beneath those albums were things that made my breath catch and tears start falling before I could stop them. Newspaper clippings carefully cut and saved. A small article from our local paper about Margaret's Place and its mission to support struggling families. A mention in a community newsletter about my volunteer work at the homeless shelter. A photo from Ethan's middle school honor society ceremony that I had no idea anyone outside our small world had even documented. But here it was printed and placed in this chest like a treasure. Eleanor had been watching. Not just remembering the daughter she'd lost, but actively following the life I'd built, documenting my survival, keeping track of her grandson's achievements from a distance she'd created, but clearly couldn't maintain in her heart. I sat on the floor beside that open chest and sobbed in a way I hadn't let myself sob since the night I was thrown out. Great heaving cries that came from somewhere so deep I'd forgotten it existed. Not from anger this time, but from the aching realization that my mother had loved me all along in her broken, inadequate way and had been too trapped by fear and weakness to show it. She'd chosen Harold's approval over my presence, but had never stopped carrying me in secret. It didn't excuse what she'd done. It didn't make the abandonment hurt less. But it complicated the story I'd been telling myself about being completely erased. I needed air. Needed space, needed to process what I'd found. I walked down to the lake, the path overgrown, but still familiar, and stood at the water's edge, watching sunlight dance across small waves. A woman approached from the neighboring property, older now, but still recognizable as Mrs. Henderson, who'd lived next door my entire childhood. "Jennifer Walsh," she said with surprise and pleasure. "I thought that was you. How wonderful to see you after all these years." We talked for a few minutes, the kind of polite catching up that happens between people who once knew each other, but whose lives have diverged completely. Then she said almost as an afterthought, "Shame about your father's company, though. Heard they're in serious trouble. Financial investigation or something. Carl, my husband, invested with them years ago, and he's been worried sick. People around here are saying the whole thing might collapse." I felt my stomach drop. "I hadn't heard," I said carefully, keeping my face neutral even as my mind raced. Mrs. Henderson patted my arm sympathetically. "Well, I'm sure you're not involved in all that anymore. Family business can be so complicated." She excused herself and walked back to her cabin, leaving me standing there with information I didn't know what to do with. Walsh Holdings in trouble. Financial investigation. The empire my father had built and protected above all else, including his own children, was crumbling. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant even, but all I felt was a strange, sad inevitability, like watching a building you'd once lived in finally succumb to rot that had been eating at its foundations for years. I stood at that lake's edge as the sun set, painting the water gold and orange and pink, and I whispered to the fading light, "Some storms you don't need to create. You just wait." I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anything except tired and strangely hollow, like I was watching something inevitable unfold that would change everything again whether I wanted it to or not. The family that had cast me out was destroying itself through its own choices, its own values that prioritized appearance over substance, reputation over humanity. I hadn't orchestrated their downfall. I'd simply survived while they slowly collapsed under the weight of their own cruelty. 2 years later, the storm I didn't create finally came. And when it did, they turned to the daughter they'd erased, begging for the mercy they never showed. 2 years passed in what felt like both an eternity and an instant. Ethan started his senior year of high school already receiving acceptance letters from universities that wanted him for his academic excellence and his remarkable essay about growing up with a single mother who taught him that grace was stronger than bitterness. Margaret's place expanded into a second location, serving more families, creating more community. I turned 40, feeling older in some ways, and younger in others, like I'd finally grown into the person I was always meant to be. The Walsh family existed in my mind as something distant, almost abstract people I'd once known in another lifetime. Until the morning I walked into the coffee shop and saw the headline on a customer's abandoned newspaper, "Walsh Holdings files for bankruptcy following internal fraud investigation." I picked up the paper with hands that had gone numb, reading words that didn't quite make sense at first, because they were too perfectly devastating to be real. The article laid out the story in merciless detail how Walsh Holdings, a commercial real estate empire built over 3 generations, had been systematically looted from within. How Sarah Walsh Thornton, appointed VP of Operations, despite having no real qualifications beyond her last name, had been embezzling funds for 3 years to support a lifestyle far beyond even her considerable salary. Falsified expense reports, money transferred between dummy accounts, construction projects that existed only on paper while the budgets disappeared into offshore accounts. The scheme had only been discovered when a contractor sued over an unpaid invoice, triggering an audit that revealed discrepancies too large to hide. Investigators estimated she'd stolen over $4 million. When confronted, Sarah had tried to shift blame to her father, claiming Harold had authorized all the transfers, that she was just following his orders. But the electronic trail told a different story, one of deliberate fraud of a woman desperate to maintain appearances, while her marriage crumbled and her spending spiraled out of control. The fallout was biblical in its totality. Harold, listed as CEO and therefore legally responsible, even if he hadn't personally stolen anything, faced potential criminal charges for negligence and failure to maintain proper oversight. The stress triggered a massive heart attack that left him hospitalized for 2 weeks. He survived, but the article mentioned he was significantly weakened, no longer the commanding presence he'd built his identity around. The Walsh estate, that mansion where I'd grown up, where I'd been thrown out in the rain, was being sold to pay creditors who were circling like sharks around a bleeding body. Assets were being liquidated, accounts, frozen lawsuits filed by investors who'd trusted the Walsh name and lost everything. The family's reputation, which Harold had protected above all else, including his own daughter, was destroyed more thoroughly than any scandal I could have created. They'd done it to themselves through greed and lies, and the same moral bankruptcy that had let them throw away a pregnant daughter without a second thought. I read articles obsessively over the following weeks, watching the story develop like a Greek tragedy, where the fatal flaw wasn't external but internal, baked into the family's values from the beginning. Eleanor had moved into a modest apartment, her social circle evaporating with the money that had sustained it. The same people who'd attended their elaborate parties now avoided her calls, unwilling to be associated with scandal. Sarah's husband Bradley filed for divorce publicly, his lawyers releasing statements about how he'd been deceived by his wife's criminal behavior. and was shocked to discover her true nature. The divorce was ugly contested, playing out in tabloid coverage that delighted in the fall of another privileged family. Sarah faced possible jail time, her lawyers arguing for leniency, while prosecutors pushed for an example to be made. The irony was almost too perfect to be believed. The family that had cast me out for bringing shame had now destroyed itself through shame of its own making, shame that was actual criminality rather than just pregnancy outside marriage. Then one evening in late October, my phone rang. Unknown number which I normally wouldn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was so broken I almost didn't recognize it as Sarah's. "Jennifer," she said, and then immediately started crying those gasping sobs that come when you've already been crying for hours and can barely catch breath between them. "Please, I know I have no right. I know what I did to you, but I'm begging you. We're losing everything. Dad's sick, he can barely walk, his heart is failing. Mom has nothing, she's in this tiny apartment and she's so alone. I've destroyed everything I touched, my marriage, the company, Dad's health. I'm probably going to jail. You're the only one who made something of yourself, who built something real. Please, I need your help." I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my sister beg for mercy she'd never shown me. The sister who'd told me not to bring my son to her wedding. The sister who'd torn up flowers and called me a whore. The sister who was now sobbing and desperate and completely without the pride that had once defined her. I felt a complex rush of emotions swirling in my chest, anger at the audacity of asking pity for how completely she'd fallen, vindication at being proven right about who really mattered, and underneath it all a terrible sadness that this was how the story had turned out. Not through my revenge, but through their own choices coming home to roost in the cruelest possible way. "Sarah," I finally said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I need time to think." It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was honest. I hung up before she could say anything else, before I could hear more tears or more desperate pleading that might sway me one direction or another. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small bedroom, listening to Ethan moving around in his room on the other side of the thin wall, wondering what kind of person I wanted to be now that the moment I'd never asked for had finally arrived. Did I want to be the person who said no, who let them drown in consequences they'd earned? Or did I want to be the person who extended help to people who'd never helped me, who chose grace even when it wasn't deserved? I didn't know. For the first time in years, I genuinely didn't know what the right answer was. They wanted mercy from the woman they erased. My son, however, had already decided what justice really looked like. I didn't tell Ethan about Sarah's call right away. I carried it inside me for 3 days, turning it over like a stone I'd found on a beach, examining it from every angle to understand its weight and shape. But Ethan had always been perceptive, reading my moods the way some people read books, and on the third night he sat down across from me at our small kitchen table and said simply, "What's wrong, Mom?" So I told him. I told him about Sarah's desperate call about the bankruptcy and the scandal, and how they'd destroyed themselves far more thoroughly than any revenge I could have designed. I told him they were asking for help from the daughter they'd erased, and I admitted I didn't know what to do with that request. I expected anger from him, or at least the kind of righteous indignation that comes from watching someone who hurt your mother finally get what they deserved. What I got instead was something that stopped me cold. "We should help them," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that felt older than his 18 years. I stared at my son, wondering if I'd misheard him. "After everything they did to us," I said, hearing my voice rise despite my attempt to stay calm. "After they threw me out, called you a mistake, told me not to bring you to Sarah's wedding. After 16 years of pretending we don't exist." Ethan stood up and left the kitchen, returning a moment later with an envelope I'd never seen before, yellowed with age, my name written across the front in handwriting that made my breath catch. "I found this 2 years ago," he said, placing it on the table between us. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to protect you from having to decide how to feel about it. But I think you need to read it now." My hands shook as I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside Eleanor's words swimming in front of my eyes, as I tried to make sense of what I was reading. Her confession about being a coward, about failing me, about the anonymous fund she'd set up for Ethan's medical needs. The words, "I pray every night for you and for the baby boy," hit me like a physical blow, and when I reached the part about the fund, everything clicked into place with devastating clarity. "The surgery," I whispered. "When you were 8, the anonymous benefactor who paid for everything." Ethan nodded, his own eyes wet with tears. "It was her mom. Grandmother saved my life. She failed you in the worst way possible, but she didn't fail me. She was broken and scared and trapped, but she still found a way to do one right thing." I read the letter 3 more times, each reading revealing new layers of pain and regret I'd never imagined my mother carrying. The tears came hard and fast, 16 years of anger and hurt mixing with this new, complicated grief for what could have been if Eleanor had been brave enough to choose love over fear from the beginning. "She loved you," Ethan said softly. "In her broken way, she loved both of us. She just didn't know how to be strong enough to show it." I looked at my son through blurred vision and saw a wisdom there that humbled me. He'd known about this for 2 years, had carried this knowledge alone, and it had shaped him into someone who could look at the people who hurt us and see their humanity rather than just their cruelty. "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting what they did," I said, needing him to understand that grace had limits, that some wounds left scars too deep to ignore. Ethan reached across the table and took my hand. "I know, Mom. I'm not saying we forget. I'm not saying we pretend it didn't hurt, or that everything's okay now. But maybe forgiveness means healing what they couldn't heal themselves. Maybe it means being strong enough to break the cycle instead of perpetuating it. You taught me that. You lived that. Your whole life has been about proving that love is stronger than bitterness, that grace is more powerful than revenge. If we turn our backs on them now, we're just continuing the cycle of hurt. We're doing to them what they did to you." His words settled over me like snow, quiet and transformative, covering the familiar landscape of my anger with something new. I thought about Margaret, about her teachings that had sustained me through the hardest years. I thought about the Christmas speech I'd given about grace being the most powerful form of strength. I thought about how I'd built a life around the principle that you don't let other people's cruelty define who you become. And I realized my son was right, even though accepting that rightness felt like swallowing broken glass. "I can't do it," I finally said. "I'm not ready to face them to help them directly. I'm just not strong enough for that yet." "Then I'll do it," Ethan said without hesitation. "Anonymously. They don't need to know it's us. I have money now, Mom. More money than I ever thought I'd have." He'd told me about the acquisition of his solar panel startup 6 months earlier, an amount so staggering I'd actually laughed because it seemed impossible that my son, barely 20 years old, could have created something worth $50 million. He'd tried to give me money, and I'd refused, telling him I didn't need it, that I'd built my life without wealth, and was happy with what I had. But this was different. This was about what kind of people we wanted to be when faced with the choice between mercy and justice. "I won't stop you," I said slowly, working through my feelings even as I spoke them. "But I won't participate either. I'm not ready for that. Maybe I never will be." Ethan stood and came around the table to hug me, and I held my son, who'd somehow grown taller and wiser than I'd realized, who'd been shaped by hardship into someone capable of extraordinary compassion. "You taught me grace by living it," he said into my hair. "Now let me practice what you preached. Let me do what they never did, the right thing." I pulled back to look at him. This young man who'd been called a mistake, but had become someone more whole and good than anyone in my family had ever been. "You're a better person than any of us," I whispered. He smiled, that gentle smile that reminded me of no one but himself. "Only because you showed me how, Mom. Only because you survived with your heart intact and taught me that was possible." We stood there in our small kitchen, mother and son, making a pact that felt both impossible and inevitable. he would help them. I would step back and let him. We would do this not because the Walshes deserved it, but because we deserved to be the kind of people who chose mercy over vengeance, who broke cycles instead of continuing them. That night after Ethan went to bed, I sat alone with Eleanor's letter and let myself grieve for everything that had been lost, all the years we'd missed, all the love that had been trapped behind fear and pride. My mother had saved my son's life while being too broken to save our relationship. It was tragic and beautiful and impossibly complicated, and I finally understood that life rarely gave you clean choices between good and evil, right and wrong. Mostly, it gave you messy, painful decisions where you had to decide who you wanted to be in the face of other people's failures. He said, "Let me do what they never did, the right thing." At 20 years old, my son understood redemption better than I ever had. Ethan moved with a deliberation I recognized as my own, the same careful planning I'd used to survive those first brutal years on my own, but applied now to an act of mercy rather than survival. Over the next year, he worked with lawyers and financial advisors he'd hired specifically for their discretion, people who understood that confidentiality wasn't just preferred but essential. He established the Margaret Foundation in early 2031, naming it after the woman who'd saved me when no one else would, the woman whose coffee shop had become my sanctuary, and whose wisdom had shaped how I raised my son. The Foundation's mission statement was deliberately broad, supporting families in crisis funding, second chances investing in ethical business transformation. But its first major action was singular and specific, offering Walsh Holdings a lifeline that would keep the company from complete destruction while fundamentally changing what it stood for. Ethan's lawyers approached the situation with tactical precision. Rather than humiliating the Walshes by swooping in to buy their failing company outright, which would have felt like a hostile takeover by vultures feeding on a corpse, they structured the offer as a partnership for redemption. The Margaret Foundation would pay off all outstanding corporate debts, settle pending lawsuits, and cover the costs of restructuring in exchange for majority ownership and complete operational control. The terms were surprisingly generous given the Walsh family's position. Harold and Eleanor could remain in a modest home rather than being forced into complete destitution. Sarah would face professional consequences and community service, but the Foundation's lawyers would work with prosecutors to keep her out of prison, arguing that restitution and rehabilitation served justice better than incarceration. Current employees would keep their jobs through the transition, protecting people who'd done nothing wrong from suffering for the family's failures. The only non-negotiable condition was that Walsh Holdings would be transformed into Walsh Green Holdings, pivoting entirely to sustainable energy and ethical business practices, becoming the kind of company that actually contributed something positive to the world, rather than just extracting wealth from it. The lawyers presented this offer to the Walsh family as coming from a private equity group specifically interested in corporate redemption stories, businesses that had failed but could be rebuilt with better values and leadership. They emphasized that the benefactors wished to remain anonymous, that this was about the mission rather than recognition. Harold received the proposal while still recovering in a hospital bed, his once powerful body now fragile and diminished, his hands trembling as he read through page after page of terms that seemed too good to be true. He kept asking the lawyers, "Why would anyone do this? What do they want from us?" The lawyers responded smoothly that some investors believed in second chances and the possibility of transformation, and that the publicity around the Walsh collapse had actually made them an attractive investment precisely because the story of their redemption could be powerful. Eleanor sat beside Harold's hospital bed reading the same documents with tears streaming down her face. This was divine intervention, she decided, punishment followed by unearned grace. God showing mercy to people who'd been brought low and broken enough to finally learn humility. She wept not just with relief, but with something that felt like repentance, the understanding that they'd been saved by forces far kinder than they deserved. Sarah, facing criminal charges and the complete destruction of her life, saw the offer as the only thread she could grasp to pull herself out of the pit she'd dug. Her lawyer had been frank with her without restitution, and without the company surviving to repay investors. Prosecutors would push for maximum sentencing to make an example of her. This mysterious foundation was literally the difference between prison and freedom, between complete ruin and the possibility of eventually rebuilding some kind of life. They signed the papers without investigating further, too desperate and broken to look closely at the gift they were receiving. The money transferred according to the complex schedule the lawyers had arranged. Debts were paid, lawsuits were settled. The Walsh name was barely marginally salvaged from complete obliteration. Harold now moved to the small house the foundation had arranged for them, whispered to Eleanor one evening, "God has given us mercy we don't deserve." Eleanor nodded slowly, but something in her heart wondered if the source was more earthly than divine, more painful than comfortable. She thought about Jennifer's Christmas speech about grace, about the daughter who'd survived their cruelty and built something beautiful from the ashes. But she didn't voice these thoughts, afraid that speaking them would make them true in ways she wasn't ready to face. Several months passed in relative stability. The company transitioned under new leadership. Ethan's foundation had brought in people with actual expertise in sustainable energy and ethical business practices. Sarah completed her community service working at a homeless shelter, in a bitter irony that wasn't lost on her, serving meals to people who reminded her uncomfortably of what her sister must have experienced. Then one afternoon in late 2032, Sarah was sorting through legal documents in the small apartment she now rented, organizing files for her lawyer, when she noticed something odd on one of the transfer authorization forms. Most documents were signed by the foundation's lawyers or financial officers, names she didn't recognize. But this particular form, buried in a stack of paperwork about the final debt settlement, had a different signature at the bottom. Small print, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully, E. Walsh, Director, Margaret Foundation. Her blood went cold. She read it again, certain she'd misunderstood, but the letters didn't change. E. Walsh. Walsh was their family name, but who in their family would have the resources to establish a foundation to orchestrate this entire rescue? Her mind raced through possibilities before landing on the one that made her hands start shaking so badly she had to put the paper down. Ethan. Jennifer's son. The boy she'd never met. The nephew who'd been told not to come to her wedding because his existence was too shameful to acknowledge. E. Walsh. Ethan Walsh. And Margaret. That was the name of the woman who'd given Jennifer a job. Jennifer had mentioned it once in some context. Sarah couldn't quite remember. The foundation was named after the woman who'd saved Jennifer, and it was run by Jennifer's son, which meant... Sarah stood up abruptly, knocking her chair over, papers scattering across the cheap linoleum floor of her apartment. Her breath came in short gasps as the full weight of realization crushed down on her. The family had been saved from bankruptcy, from complete destruction, from Sarah's own criminal consequences, by the very child they'd rejected before he was even born. The mistake, the shame, the grandson Harold had called worthless. That boy had grown into a man with more money and power and grace than any of them had ever possessed, and he'd used those resources to rescue the people who'd wanted him erased from existence. She thought she might vomit. She thought she might faint. She stood in her small apartment, surrounded by evidence of her fall from privilege, and she understood with devastating clarity that their salvation had come from the place they'd least expected and least deserved. She didn't tell Harold or Eleanor that day, couldn't find the words to explain what she'd discovered. She was too ashamed, too stunned by the cosmic justice of it all. But she knew that eventually the truth would surface, that secrets like this never stayed buried forever. And when it did, when her parents finally understood who had saved them, the weight of their cruelty would become undeniable, a burden they'd carry for whatever years they had left. The name made her tremble. It couldn't be. The grandson they called a mistake had become their salvation. Sarah carried the truth alone for 3 days before the weight of it became unbearable. She drove to the small house where her parents now lived, a modest 2-bedroom cottage that would have fit inside the foyer of their former mansion, and found them in the living room that was too small for all their remaining furniture. Harold sat propped in his chair, oxygen tank beside him, the once commanding patriarch, now reduced to shallow breaths and trembling hands. Eleanor was doing a crossword puzzle, a mundane activity that would have been beneath her in their previous life. Sarah stood in the doorway and said, "I need to tell you something about the foundation," and watched their faces turn toward her with cautious hope, as if any news at all might be good news in their diminished circumstances. "The foundation that saved us," Sarah began, her voice breaking before she could continue. "It was founded by Ethan, Jennifer's son, the boy we—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say aloud what they'd done, what she specifically had done by writing those words on a wedding invitation. Harold's face went through a progression that Sarah watched like time-lapse photography of decay, confusion furrowing his brow, denial, pulling his mouth tight, recognition widening his eyes, horror draining all color from his cheeks, and finally something that looked like his soul collapsing inward as crushing shame settled over features that had once held nothing but arrogant certainty. He tried to speak, mouth opening and closing soundlessly before finally managing, How did he become this?" The question hung in the air like an accusation turned inward. Eleanor, who'd been so still, Sarah thought she might not have heard, suddenly began crying with the kind of sobs that come from somewhere deep and broken, the kind you can't control or contain. "Jennifer," she whispered through tears. "She raised him the way we should have raised our children. She gave him what we never gave you or Sarah, real love, unconditional love, the kind that builds character instead of just maintaining appearances." Harold closed his eyes as if he could block out the truth by not seeing his wife's face, but there was no escape from what they were being forced to understand. The grandson he'd dismissed as a stain on the family name, the child he'd wanted erased before birth, was not only real and alive, but had become someone more successful, more principled, more fundamentally good than anyone their family had produced in generations. And this young man who owed them nothing, who had every right to watch them drown in the consequences of their own choices, had chosen instead to save them. Harold spent that entire night awake, his mind refusing rest as he processed what Sarah had told them. By morning, he'd made a decision. With hands that shook from age and illness and shame, he wrote a letter that took him hours to compose because he kept starting over, trying to find words adequate to a situation where no words could possibly be enough. "Jennifer and Ethan," he finally wrote, "I was wrong. I was cruel. I destroyed my family for the sake of pride and reputation that turned out to mean nothing. You owed us nothing less than nothing after what we did to you, yet your son saved us from complete ruin. I don't ask for forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it. I don't expect reconciliation because I understand that ship sailed the night I threw you out in the rain. But I need you to know that I see now finally what I threw away. You were never the shame, Jennifer. I was. I am. You built something real while we built nothing but a facade that collapsed the moment it was tested. Your son is evidence of everything we failed to be. Please tell him that his grandfather died knowing he was wrong about everything that mattered." He sent the letter through the same lawyers who'd handled the Foundation's offer, too afraid and ashamed to attempt direct contact. Days passed with no response. Then a week. Then 2 weeks. The silence was somehow worse than anger, would have been more damning than any accusation. What Harold didn't know was that Ethan had received the letter, had read it while sitting in his apartment overlooking the city. His face expressionless as he absorbed his grandfather's confession. He'd folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, neither burning it in anger nor treasuring it with forgiveness, just acknowledging its existence before moving on with his day. When Jennifer's copy arrived, she'd asked Ethan to summarize it, unable to bring herself to read Harold's handwriting to process his words directly. After Ethan told her what it said, she'd been quiet for a long moment before saying simply, "Tell them we received it." Not "tell them I forgive them" or "tell them it's okay now." Just acknowledgement that the message had arrived, had been noted, and required no further response. The silence that followed that brief statement was louder than any words could have been, a void where reconciliation might have lived if the wounds weren't too deep and the time too late. But Ethan had one more move to make, one more lesson to teach not just his family, but the world watching. At 23, he'd become someone people paid attention to, a young entrepreneur whose startup success had made headlines, a philanthropist whose foundation was already changing lives, someone who represented a new generation's approach to wealth and responsibility. When he called a press conference, journalists and cameras filled the room, sensing a story worth covering. He stood at the podium in a simple suit, no flashy watch or designer accessories. Just a young man who'd learned from his mother that real power doesn't need to announce itself loudly. "My name is Ethan Walsh," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I'm the grandson of Harold Walsh, founder of Walsh Holdings. I'm also the child my family called a mistake, the boy my grandfather wanted erased before I was born." The room went absolutely silent, every phone recording, every journalist leaning forward. Ethan continued without hesitation. "Today, I'm announcing that the Margaret Foundation, which I founded and named after the woman who saved my mother when her own family abandoned her, has acquired majority ownership of Walsh Green Holdings. I want to be clear about why I did this, not for revenge, not to humiliate anyone, but to honor my mother, Jennifer Walsh, who taught me that love never needs permission and grace is more powerful than bitterness. She raised me to believe that you break cycles of hurt rather than continue them, that you judge people by their character rather than their circumstances of birth. My family called me a mistake. My mother called me her miracle. I built this foundation to prove she was right." The room erupted, questions shouted over each other, cameras flashing the story already being typed into phones and laptops as it happened. Within an hour, the video was everywhere, shared and reshared, until it became one of those cultural moments that transcends the original context. The world saw him as a hero. They saw me as the mother who raised one. But my father saw him as the judgment he'd been running from his entire life. The press conference did something to Harold that bankruptcy and shame couldn't quite accomplish. It broke whatever was left of him that had been holding on. Seeing his grandson on television screens across the country, watching this articulate young man who carried the Walsh name describe being called a mistake by the grandfather who'd wanted him erased. Hearing Ethan speak about grace and love, with a wisdom Harold had never possessed, was apparently more than his damaged heart could withstand. 3 months later, in the early hours of a February morning, Harold suffered a second massive heart attack. This one was fatal, though it took him 2 days to die, his body clinging stubbornly to life, even as his mind drifted in and out of consciousness. Eleanor sat beside his hospital bed during those final hours, holding the hand that had once wielded so much power and now could barely squeeze back, listening to him repeat one name over and over in his delirium: Jennifer. "I need to see her," he'd whisper when consciousness surfaced briefly. "I need to tell her." But he never had the strength to finish the sentence, and Eleanor never knew what words he was trying to summon. On the morning of the second day, with Harold still alive but fading, Eleanor called the lawyer who'd been handling communications between the families and asked him to contact Jennifer with a message: "Your father is dying and he's asking for you." The lawyer called me, his voice professionally neutral, delivering the information without editorial. I held the phone for 20 minutes after hanging up, staring at nothing, feeling nothing, until Ethan found me sitting motionless at the kitchen table. "You don't owe him anything, Mom," he said gently. "But you might owe yourself closure." I didn't go to the hospital, couldn't bring myself to stand beside that bed and watch the man who'd thrown me out now reduced to begging for my presence in his final hours. It felt like it would be a betrayal of the younger me who'd survived his cruelty, like I'd be giving him something he didn't earn just because death was making him sentimental. But when the funeral came 4 days later, I found myself driving to the church where I'd been baptized, where I'd attended services every Sunday of my childhood, where the Walsh family had maintained their pew for 3 generations. I parked at a distance and walked until I could see the building, but stayed beneath the sheltering branches of a large oak tree wearing dark sunglasses and a simple black coat that wouldn't draw attention. I watched from maybe 100 feet away as people I vaguely recognized filed into the church as the casket was carried by men in dark suits, as Eleanor walked behind it leaning on Sarah's arm. both of them dressed in expensive mourning clothes that looked strange against their diminished circumstances. I didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel the satisfaction I'd sometimes imagined in my angriest moments about watching my father's funeral from a distance. I just felt tired and empty, like I'd carried something heavy for so long that putting it down left me lighter, but also strangely hollow. The eulogies lasted an hour. I learned later people speaking about Harold Walsh's business acumen and his contributions to the community, sanitized versions of a man most of them had never really known. When people finally began leaving, filtering out into the cemetery in small groups, talking quietly, I almost turned to go. Then Eleanor glanced in my direction, just a casual sweep of her eyes across the landscape, and stopped. Her hand went to her chest. We stared at each other across that distance grass and graves, and 17 years of silence between us, and I saw her mouth form my name without sound. Neither of us moved toward the other. Neither spoke. But something passed between us in that moment of eye contact, something that might have been acknowledgement or grief, or the wordless apology of a mother who'd failed her daughter, met with the equally wordless acceptance that it was too late for words to matter anyway. I turned and walked back toward my car, my footsteps loud in the winter silence. Behind me, I knew Eleanor was watching me leave, probably crying, probably whispering things to the air that I would never hear. When I got home, Ethan asked if I was okay. I told him I was and realized I meant it. I'd gone not for Harold but for myself to close a chapter that had been open too long to see with my own eyes, that the man who'd defined so much of my pain was really gone and couldn't hurt me anymore. That was the closest we ever came to forgiveness. A look across a cemetery. My father died without hearing me say his name. I lived with that choice and made peace with it. 3 days after the funeral, I woke before dawn with the certainty that I needed to go back to the cemetery alone. The sky was still gray when I arrived, mist hanging low over the headstones like breath in cold air, the world wrapped in that particular silence that comes just before sunrise, when even the birds haven't started singing yet. I found Harold's grave easily. It was still fresh, the earth dark, and settled a temporary marker in place until the permanent headstone could be installed. That marker bore just the essentials: Harold James Walsh, his dates, and beneath them, the single word father, that felt simultaneously like an accusation and a plea, though I couldn't quite determine which. I stood there for a long time, hands in my coat pockets, looking down at that word. Father. He'd been that technically biologically, but the role encompassed so much more than genetics, and he'd abdicated most of it the night he threw me out. I didn't pray because I'd never been sure what to pray for when it came to Harold. Forgiveness felt dishonest. Damnation felt too cruel. So I just stood in silence until I was ready to do what I'd come to do. From my bag I pulled a single white orchid, the same flower I'd sent to Sarah's wedding all those years ago, and placed it carefully on the disturbed earth. It was a symbol, a statement I was here. I existed. You tried to erase me, and I outlasted your shame. I outlasted you. I spoke aloud to the stone, my voice the only sound in the fog-wrapped cemetery. I hope you found peace, Dad. I did without you. The words came out matter-of-fact rather than bitter. Just a simple truth delivered to someone who could no longer argue with it. Then I turned and walked away, my footsteps on the gravel path, the only sound disturbing the morning stillness. And I didn't look back because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. That same week, though, I didn't know it at the time. Eleanor sat in her small apartment surrounded by the modest furniture that was all she'd been able to keep from their former life. She'd been going through old photo albums, something she did now with increasing frequency, as if she could reverse time by studying it closely enough. In her hands, she held a photograph from Jennifer's childhood, maybe second grade, showing a little girl with missing front teeth and a huge smile holding a blue ribbon from the school's spelling bee. Eleanor remembered that day with painful clarity, how Jennifer had run to her shouting, "Mommy, I won," with such pure, uncomplicated joy, and how Eleanor had hugged her tight and felt genuine pride untainted by any calculation about what it meant for the family's reputation or social standing. When had that joyful child become the daughter she threw away? When did fear become more powerful than love? When did she stop being a mother and start being merely a curator of appearances? Her hands trembled as she traced Jennifer's face in the photograph, the glossy surface worn smooth in places from years of touch. "I failed you," she whispered to the image, her voice breaking. "I failed both of you." There was no one to hear her confession. Harold was dead buried 3 days ago. Jennifer was gone, perhaps permanently separated by wounds too deep for casual healing. Sarah barely spoke to her except when necessary, their relationship strained by years of disappointment on both sides. All Eleanor had left was regret and memories of a family she'd helped destroy through weakness, disguised as strength, through choosing comfort over courage at every crucial moment. In the end, both women left that cemetery the same week, though they didn't know they were participating in the same ritual of release. Jennifer walked toward her future feeling lighter with each step, as the burden of her father's judgment settled into the earth with his body. Eleanor walked toward her, past feeling heavier with the weight of choices that could never be undone, mistakes that couldn't be apologized away. Neither looked back. There was no tearful reunion, no dramatic reconciliation scene where violins swelled and forgiveness washed away decades of hurt. Just two people choosing to survive their grief in their own separate ways, acknowledging that some relationships end not with resolution, but simply with ending. Jennifer understood as she drove home that some wounds don't heal in the traditional sense, they just stop bleeding. The pain becomes familiar enough to carry without it defining every step. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes survival and peace are the same thing, just viewed from different angles. She'd survived. She'd built a life. She'd raised a son who was better than any of them. The rest was just details, and her father was now just memory, and memory couldn't hurt her anymore unless she gave it permission. We both walked away lighter, but not together. Some endings don't come with closure. They come with release. In the months following Harold's death, Ethan and I both channeled our energy into building something that would outlast the pain our family had created. Ethan launched the Quiet Heart Foundation in the spring of 2035, a project he'd been planning for over a year, dedicated specifically to supporting single mothers, children born into difficult circumstances, and foster youth aging out of the system. The foundation offered everything from college scholarships to medical bill assistance, from housing support to mentorship programs that paired successful adults with young people who needed someone to believe in them. At the launch press event, standing before cameras and donors and journalists who'd been following his story since the Walsh Holdings revelation, Ethan explained the foundation's name with characteristic simplicity. For those who survived quietly, who fought without applause, who loved without permission, this is for you. He never mentioned me by name, but I watched the live stream from my coffee shop and knew that everyone in that room understood who had inspired this work. Within 6 months, the foundation had raised $12 million and was operating in 15 states. Forbes named Ethan to their 30 Under 30 list in the social entrepreneurship category, calling him the redemption story America needed. Watching my son transform his pain into purpose gave me permission to expand my own work. Margaret's Place had always been more than just a coffee shop. It had been a sanctuary for women who needed one, a space where struggling mothers could bring their children without judgment, where conversations happened over refilled coffee cups about survival and hope. But I'd been thinking bigger, dreaming of transforming the space into a full community center that could offer more than just caffeine and a listening ear. By late 2034, with some of the money Ethan had insisted I accept from his success, I'd purchased the building next door and broken through the wall, creating room for childcare services, job training classes, support groups, and a small library of donated books. I renamed it Margaret's Place Where Second Chances Bloom, and hired staff who understood the mission because they'd lived it themselves. Former single mothers who'd rebuilt their lives, women who'd escaped abusive relationships, immigrants who'd started over in a new country with nothing but determination. The walls became covered with photographs of our graduates, women who'd come through our doors broken and left empowered, who'd gotten their GEDs or learned job skills or just found a community that reminded them they mattered. I didn't seek publicity or give interviews when local reporters came asking. My work was quiet, local, deeply personal, but word spread the way important things do through whispered recommendations and social media posts from grateful women, and soon people were driving from neighboring counties to find the place where Jennifer Walsh, the woman from those viral videos, the one who'd survived exile and raised that remarkable son, ran a center that actually understood what struggle meant. I'd become, without intending to, a pillar of strength for an entire community of women who saw their own stories reflected in mine. Then, one afternoon in early 2035, while I was teaching a resume workshop to 6 women who'd been out of the workforce for years, my assistant brought me an envelope that had arrived in the regular mail. The moment I saw Eleanor's handwriting, my stomach clenched with a familiar dread. I almost threw it away unopened, almost asked my assistant to dispose of it so I wouldn't have to decide whether to read it. But Ethan happened to be visiting that day, helping to repair a broken table in the children's area. And when he saw me standing frozen with the envelope in my hands, he came over and said gently, "Mom, maybe it's time." I opened it with trembling hands, pulling out a single sheet of Eleanor's personal stationery covered in handwriting that looked shakier than I remembered, less controlled. "Jennifer," it began. "I'm ill. The doctors say I don't have much time, a few months at most. I don't expect you to care. I don't expect you to come. I've forfeited the right to expect anything from you. But there's something I need to tell you before I die, something about Margaret, about me, about the photograph I gave you 17 years ago when I put you out of our home. It's a truth I should have told you long ago, but I was too ashamed, too afraid of what you'd think of me. If you're willing to hear an old woman's confession, I'll be at Mercy Hospital room 412. If you don't come, I understand. I love you. I always did, even when I was too weak to show it. Mom." I read it twice, then a third time, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Margaret. What could Eleanor possibly know about Margaret? The woman who'd saved me had died 10 years ago, and I'd mourned her like the mother Eleanor had never been. What secret could Eleanor be carrying about someone she'd never even met? Or so I'd always believed. The photograph I'd kept it all these years, that mysterious image of Eleanor holding a baby in 1978, words on the back that had never made sense. My hands were shaking as I looked up at Ethan, who was watching me with concern. "What is it, Mom?" he asked softly. And then, out of nowhere, a letter arrived from her. My mother was dying, and she had a secret about Margaret. A secret that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my family. I'll proceed with writing part 20 following the standard requirements. Length 700 to 750 words. First-person perspective. Smooth connection to previous section. No repetition of previous following sections. Continuous prose with no separators or icons. Develop only the points described for part 20. I carried Eleanor's letter in my pocket for 3 days, taking it out at odd moments to reread those few lines about Margaret, about the photograph, about secrets that apparently needed confession before death, made confession impossible. Part of me wanted to crumple it up and throw it away, to let Eleanor die with her secrets the way she'd let me struggle with mine for 17 years. Why should I rush to her bedside after she'd spent nearly 2 decades pretending I didn't exist? But another part of me, the part that had spent years teaching women at Margaret's place about breaking cycles and choosing healing over bitterness, whispered that closure wasn't something you did for the dying. It was something you did for yourself, for the living version of you that had to keep going after everyone else was gone. On the 3rd evening, Ethan found me sitting in my office staring at the letter for probably the 100th time. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He just sat down across from me and said, "I can't tell you what to do, Mom, but I can tell you this. I went to Grandfather's funeral. I don't regret it. Not because he deserved my presence, but because I needed to close that chapter for myself. Maybe you need to close yours." His words settled something inside me that had been restless and uncertain, gave me permission to make a choice that felt true, rather than performatively strong. The next morning, I drove to Mercy Hospital. My decision made, but still fragile hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. I'd been clear with Ethan before I left. I'm not going to forgive her. I'm not going to pretend the past didn't happen. I'm going because I need to hear what she has to say about Margaret, and then I'm leaving, and it's over. He'd hugged me and told me he understood that whatever I decided was okay, that I didn't owe anyone anything, including explanations for my choices. As I parked in the hospital lot and walked through automatic doors that hissed open into antiseptic air and fluorescent lighting, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't nervous, wasn't angry, wasn't even particularly sad. I was just calm, settled in my own skin in a way that felt earned through years of surviving. Eleanor couldn't hurt me anymore, because I'd already survived the worst thing she could do, and I'd come out the other side whole. That realization was liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Room 412 was at the end of a long corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner, and the particular staleness of air that's been breathed too many times. I knocked softly, more out of habit than any real concern for Eleanor's privacy, and pushed open the door. The woman in the bed looked nothing like the elegant, controlled mother I remembered. Eleanor had always been carefully put together, hairstyled makeup, subtle, but present posture perfect even in casual moments. This woman was frail and thin, her once elegant features now sunken with illness, skin the color of old paper hair, flat against the pillow. But her eyes were the same, and when they met mine, they immediately filled with tears that spilled over and ran down her hollow cheeks. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse and threadbare. "I didn't think you would." I didn't rush to her bedside, didn't take her hand or offer comfort. I stood near the door, arms crossed, maintaining the emotional distance I'd spent 17 years building. "I came for answers," I said evenly, my voice neither cruel nor kind, just factual. "You mentioned Margaret. What do you know about Margaret?" Eleanor nodded weakly, understanding that this visit had conditions that I wasn't here for reconciliation or deathbed absolution. "Sit down, please," she said. "This will take a moment to explain." I hesitated, every instinct telling me that sitting would be a concession, an intimacy I hadn't agreed to grant. But I needed to hear this, whatever it was, so I pulled the visitor's chair closer to the bed, close enough to hear her weakened voice, far enough to maintain the boundary I needed. Eleanor took a shaky breath that rattled in her chest, closed her eyes for a moment as if gathering courage, then opened them and looked directly at me. "I need to start in 1978, she said quietly, "when I was 16 years old." I walked into that hospital room with no hate left, just questions. What she told me would shatter and heal me in the same breath. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, each word requiring visible effort, but her eyes held mine with an intensity that suggested this confession had been weighing on her for far longer than just the weeks since her diagnosis. "When I was 16, she began, tears already streaming down her sunken cheeks. "I got pregnant. It was 1978. My parents were horrified, not concerned for me, you understand, but horrified that I'd shamed the family. They sent me away to one of those homes for unwed mothers, places where girls like me were hidden until the problem could be dealt with. I gave birth to a daughter in a cold room with strangers attending, and they took her from me the moment she was born. I never even held her, never counted her fingers or looked into her eyes or did any of the things mothers are supposed to do. They told me she was being adopted by a poor family who couldn't have children of their own and that I was never to speak of her again. They told me to forget she existed, to go home and pretend those 9 months had never happened." My chest tightened, breath catching in my throat as I began to understand where this story was leading, though my mind refused to make the final connection because it seemed too impossibly painful to be true. Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "For 40 years I buried that pain. I married your father, had you and Sarah built a life that looked perfect from the outside. But I never forgot her. Never stopped wondering where she was, if she was happy, if she ever thought about the mother who'd given her away. 15 years ago, when you were already gone and I was alone with my regrets, I hired a private investigator. It took him months, but he found her. Her name was Margaret. She'd been raised by a working-class family in the same state, never knew she was adopted until I reached out. I contacted her carefully through letters, at first explaining who I was and why I was looking for her. Margaret. I whispered the name, falling from my lips like a stone into still water ripples of understanding, spreading outward in waves that threatened to drown me. Eleanor nodded, fresh tears spilling faster now. She was angry at first, understandably. Felt betrayed by everyone, by me for giving her up, by her adoptive parents for never telling her the truth, by the universe for making her life harder than it needed to be. But Margaret had something I never had: real strength, the kind that comes from surviving, rather than just appearing to survive. Eventually, slowly, she forgave me. We met in secret, in coffee shops and parks where no one we knew would see us. I couldn't tell Harold or anyone else because I was too ashamed, too afraid of what people would think if they knew about the daughter I'd given away. The room seemed to tilt around me as Eleanor continued. When I saw you were pregnant, when your father threw you out just like my parents had done to me, I couldn't stop history from repeating itself. I was too weak to stand up to Harold, too trapped in the same patterns my parents had taught me. But I could give you that photograph, hoping someday you'd understand what it meant, that you'd know you weren't the first daughter I'd failed. Margaret knew who you were the moment you walked into her cafe. I'd told her about you, about what had happened, and she recognized you from photos I'd shown her. She saved you because she couldn't save herself, because she understood exactly what it felt like to be thrown away. And she forgave me in ways I could never forgive myself. I sat frozen, my entire understanding of my history rewriting itself in real time. Margaret, the woman who'd given me a job when I had nothing, who'd offered me a room above her shop, who'd taught me about grace and breaking cycles, who'd seemed to understand my pain in ways that felt almost supernatural, had been my sister, my older half-sister. The first daughter Eleanor had abandoned, come back decades later to save the second daughter from the same fate. All those knowing looks, that cryptic wisdom about how they'd remember me someday. The photograph of Harold in her wallet that she'd called an old friend, her death in 2015, that had devastated me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Suddenly all of it made terrible, beautiful, heartbreaking sense. She never told me, I whispered through tears that were now pouring down my face unchecked. She let me think she was just a good person, who happened to be kind. Eleanor reached out with a hand that trembled from illness and age, and I found myself taking it not in forgiveness exactly, but in shared grief for the woman we'd both loved and lost. She was a good person. Eleanor said, her voice full of a pride she'd never been able to show openly. Better than I ever was, stronger than I ever could be. She broke the cycle I couldn't break. She saved you when I was too weak to save myself. And in saving you, she saved me from becoming the same monster my parents were, even though I'd already failed you the same way they'd failed me. Eleanor's breathing became more labored, each inhale a struggle, her grip on my hand loosening as her strength faded. I don't ask you to forgive me, Jennifer, she said, each word slower than the last. I just needed you to know that I loved you every single day. I was weak, not heartless. There's a difference even if the result was the same. And you became everything I should have been. You raised Ethan the way I should have raised you and Sarah. You broke what I couldn't break. I leaned closer, my own tears dripping onto our joined hands, and heard myself say words I hadn't planned. You taught me everything, Mom, including how not to become you. Eleanor smiled faintly through her pain, a real smile that reached her fading eyes. Then I did something right after all, she whispered. Her eyes closed slowly like curtains falling at the end of a play. Her breathing became shallower, the spaces between breaths growing longer until they simply stopped. I held her hand as she slipped away, the years of silence and hurt and missed chances finally bridged in the last possible moment. A nurse entered quietly, checked Eleanor's vitals with practiced efficiency, and gave me a gentle nod. She's gone, the nurse said softly. I'm sorry for your loss." I sat there for a long time after the nurse left, still holding the hand that had once pushed me away and had ultimately, through the most circuitous route imaginable, led me to Margaret, my sister, my savior, my secret guardian angel, who'd known exactly who I was and had chosen to love me anyway. She passed that night holding my hand. The cycle of exile ended where it began, with a mother and daughter finally understanding each other too late. Eleanor's funeral was small and quiet, held at a funeral home chapel rather than the grand church where Harold's had been. Just me, Ethan, Sarah, and a handful of elderly women from Eleanor's former charity boards, who came more out of obligation than genuine affection. Sarah stood on the opposite side of the casket from me, her face drawn and older than her years, and we barely exchanged words beyond the necessary pleasantries. She looked at me once with something that might have been envy, or resentment, or just exhausted grief, but she didn't speak, and I didn't push. Some relationships were too broken to repair, and I'd made my peace with that. Eleanor's will, read by a lawyer 2 days later, contained a final request. She wanted her ashes scattered at Lake Tahoe, at the cabin where our family had spent summers pretending to be happy. "The only place I was ever truly at peace," she'd written. Ethan and I drove to the lake together on an early morning in late spring when the air was still cool and the world felt suspended between night and day. We didn't talk much during the 4-hour drive, just occasional comments about the landscape changing as we climbed into the mountains, comfortable silence between us, the way it had always been. When we arrived at the cabin and walked down to the water's edge, the lake was perfectly still, mist hanging over the surface like breath. The surrounding pines reflected so clearly, it was hard to tell where the real trees ended and their mirror images began. I stood there holding the simple ceramic urn containing what remained of Eleanor Walsh, and I found myself remembering not the painful endings, but the beginnings. Summers, when I was 7, 8, 9, running barefoot on wooden docks. My mother's rare laughter when she let herself forget about appearances and just existed. The particular smell of pine and clean water that meant summer and safety, and a version of family that felt real even if it was temporary. I thought about the 3 women whose stories had braided together in ways none of us had fully understood while we were living them. Eleanor, who'd carried the shame of giving away a daughter for 40 years, who'd let that shame make her weak when she should have been strong, who'd repeated with me the same cruelty her parents had inflicted on her because she didn't know how to break patterns she'd been taught were normal. Margaret, who'd grown up abandoned and given to strangers, but had somehow emerged kind instead of bitter, strong instead of broken, who'd chosen to save her half-sister rather than punish her for the mother's failures, who'd forgiven Eleanor, even though forgiveness wasn't earned or deserved. And me, who'd survived exile by building something real from nothing. Who'd raised a son that proved love was stronger than shame, who'd learned from both women, from Eleanor's failures and Margaret's grace, how to be someone neither of them had quite managed to become. I opened the urn and began scattering Eleanor's ashes across the calm water, watching the gray dust catch the breeze and drift outward in patterns that looked almost intentional, mixing with the lake, dissolving into something larger than one woman's pain and regret. Ethan stood beside me, his presence steady and silent, giving me space for whatever I needed to feel. As the last of the ashes fell from my hands and disappeared into water that would carry them to depths I couldn't see, I closed my eyes and heard, or imagined I heard, or needed to hear. Margaret's voice carried on the wind that familiar tone that had guided me through the hardest years of my life. "You did it, Jenny. You ended it with grace." I smiled through tears that were equal parts grief and relief and gratitude for a woman who'd saved me without ever telling me we were family, who'd loved me enough to let me think her kindness was random rather than predestined by blood. "Thank you, Margaret," I whispered to the air, to the water, to the memory of someone who existed now only in the hearts of people who'd known her. For everything. For being the mother she couldn't be. For being the sister I never knew I had. For showing me that cycles can be broken if someone's brave enough to break them. The words floated over the lake, carried by the same breeze that had taken Eleanor's ashes, unheard by anyone but myself and whatever remained of the people we'd lost. We stood there in silence for several minutes, neither of us ready to leave, both of us understanding this was an ending that needed time and space to settle properly. Finally, as we walked back toward the cabin and the car beyond it, Ethan asked quietly, "Do you think she's at peace now, grandmother?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to give him an answer that was honest rather than comforting. I think she made peace the only way she could, by telling the truth before she died. That's more than a lot of people manage. She carried her secrets for decades, and in the end she chose honesty over comfort. That takes a kind of courage, even if it came late. Ethan nodded, processing this, then asked, "And Margaret?" My voice caught in my throat before I could answer. Margaret made peace by choosing love over bitterness. She had every reason to be angry, abandoned at birth, raised by people who weren't her blood, lied to about her origins. But she turned all that pain into kindness instead of cruelty. She was the strongest of all of us, and I didn't even know why until now. She broke the cycle not by talking about it, but by living differently, by being the person Eleanor and her parents weren't capable of being. Ethan reached over and squeezed my hand as we got into the car, and we drove back down the mountain in comfortable silence, the kind that comes after important things have been said and processed and can now be left to settle into memory. The lake disappeared behind us as we descended, carrying its burden of 3 generations' worth of secrets now dissolved into water and memory. Sharp edges worn smooth by time and confession, no longer capable of drawing blood the way they once had. The past was behind us, literally and figuratively, and what lay ahead was a future we got to define ourselves, free from the weight of shame and exile that had defined the women who came before us. The past was gone, but it left me something to keep. Not bitterness, not pride, just clarity. The clarity I'd found at the lake stayed with me in the weeks that followed, settling into my bones like something I'd been missing without knowing it. I understood now that my story wasn't just mine, it was part of a larger pattern of women trying and failing, and sometimes succeeding to break cycles they'd inherited. One evening, alone in my apartment with rain pattering against the windows, I sat at my small desk and pulled out a sheet of good paper, the kind with weight and texture that announced importance. I'd been composing a letter in my head for months, maybe years, and suddenly it felt urgent to get the words out of my mind and onto something tangible that could outlast me. "My dearest Ethan," I wrote, my hand steady despite the tears that were already forming. "You were born into rejection and raised in exile, but you became living proof that love doesn't need permission. You learned grace not from comfort or privilege, but from watching me survive when survival was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I want you to know something I've never said directly. The greatest revenge I ever took was living well, loving deeply, and refusing to let cruelty make me cruel. I could have become bitter. God knows I had reason enough, but I chose differently, because I understood that becoming like them would have meant they'd won, that they'd successfully defined who I was by their rejection rather than my response." I paused, wiping my eyes, then continued. "Your grandmother Eleanor and I both learned too late that fear is louder than love, only if you let it be. She let fear win for most of her life, and it cost her everything that mattered. I tried not to make the same mistake, though I'm sure I failed in ways I couldn't see. Don't let it be, Ethan. Don't let fear be the loudest voice in any room you enter. You've already surpassed me in forgiveness, not because you're naive or weak, but because you're strong enough to carry mercy where I could only carry survival. Keep going. Break every cycle that needs breaking. Love loudly and without apology. And remember that Margaret's place isn't just a building with my name on it. It's a promise to every person who walks through those doors that second chances are real, that you can be thrown away and still become something beautiful, that family is what you build rather than what you're born into." With the letter I included 2 photographs. The first was the one Eleanor had given me 17 years ago, that mysterious image of her holding baby Margaret in 1978 with "my first daughter" written on the back in my grandmother's handwriting. The second was a photo from the Christmas 2026 event, me and Ethan standing in front of the photo wall we'd created, both of us smiling with genuine joy, surrounded by people who'd chosen to be our family. I wrote beneath them in careful script, "Two generations saved by women who refused to stay silent. Margaret saved me. I tried to save you by raising you right. Now you save others. Pass this understanding on to whoever comes after you. This is our inheritance, not money or property or a family name, but the knowledge that cycles can be broken if someone is brave enough to be the one who breaks them." I sealed the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, addressed it to Ethan in my best penmanship, and sat staring at it for a long moment. Tomorrow I'd take it to the bank and place it in a safety deposit box with instructions for it to be given to him after my death, whenever that came. It wasn't a morbid act, I told myself. It was completion. It was writing the final chapter of a story that had begun in shame and was ending in strength, ensuring that the lessons learned at such cost wouldn't die with me. But that very night, as if the universe had other plans for when wisdom should be shared, Ethan knocked on my apartment door unexpectedly. "Mom, you home." I quickly tried to wipe my tears and shoved the envelope into a drawer, but I wasn't fast enough. He came into the room and saw me sitting at my desk with red eyes and an envelope clutched in my hands, and his face immediately filled with concern. "Mom, what's wrong? What is that?" "It's nothing," I said too quickly, my voice giving away the lie. "Just memories. I was being sentimental." But Ethan had known me too long to be fooled by deflections. He walked over and gently asked, "Is that letter for me?" I hesitated, my first instinct still to hide it away, to keep my wisdom locked until I was safely dead and couldn't see how he received it. But looking at my son's face, I realized how ridiculous that impulse was. Why wait to share what I'd learned? Why make him wait until grief and loss to hear words that might matter to him now, while I was still here to see them land, to answer questions, to continue the conversation? "It's supposed to be for after I'm gone," I admitted, holding out the envelope with shaking hands. "But maybe you should read it now, so you know what I wanted you to understand." Ethan took the envelope carefully, like it was something precious and breakable, and sat down on the edge of my bed to read. I watched his face as his eyes moved across the page, saw tears begin to fall that he didn't bother wiping away, watched him study the photographs with a tenderness that made my own tears start again. When he finally finished, he looked up at me with eyes that held so much love I could barely stand it. "You don't need to wait until you're gone to tell me this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my hero now, Mom. Not someday, not after you die, right now, every single day." He stood and crossed the small room to where I sat, pulling me up into a hug so tight it felt like he was trying to hold all the broken pieces of me together. I held him back just as fiercely, this son who'd been called a mistake but had become the best thing I'd ever created, and I realized he was absolutely right. Legacy wasn't something you left behind like furniture in a will. It was what you built while you were still breathing, still capable of adding to it, still able to see the impact of your choices. That night we stayed up until almost dawn talking about Margaret and Eleanor and Sarah, about cycles of pain and the courage it takes to break them, about forgiveness and grace, and the difference between the two, about how love really doesn't need permission from anyone to be real and true and powerful. He said, "You don't need to be gone for me to know who you are." And I realized legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're still here. The conversation Ethan and I had that night about legacy and living fully in the present seemed to unlock something in both of us, a permission to step more boldly into our purpose rather than waiting for the perfect moment that might never come. 2 months later, in the late summer of 2035, Ethan received an invitation that made him call me immediately. His voice excited in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child. The National Philanthropy and Social Impact Summit in Washington, D.C., wanted him to deliver the keynote address to share the story behind the Quiet Heart Foundation and what they called his philosophy of redemptive giving. It was one of the most prestigious events in the nonprofit world, attended by everyone who mattered in the space. Major donors, foundation, leaders, politicians who controlled funding, and thousands of people working on the ground to make change happen. When Ethan came to tell me in person, sitting across from me at Margaret's place after closing time, he said something that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "I'm not just telling my story, Mom. I'm telling yours. You deserve to be seen." I immediately shook my head, that old instinct to stay small and quiet rising up like a reflex. "I don't need recognition, Ethan. I've never wanted to be visible like that. The work is what matters, not me." But he leaned forward, his face serious, and said words that cut through my resistance. "I know you don't need it, Mom, but a lot of people need to hear it. Single mothers right now who think they've failed their children. Kids who feel like mistakes, like they shouldn't exist. They need to know your story. They need to know that someone survived what they're surviving, that exile doesn't have to be the end. Please come. You don't have to be on stage. Just be there." So I agreed, and 3 weeks later found myself sitting in an enormous conference hall in Washington, surrounded by thousands of people I didn't know, feeling simultaneously exposed and invisible in the way you do in large crowds. The stage was massive, the lighting professional, and dramatic cameras positioned to capture everything for the live stream that would reach millions more watching from home. When Ethan walked onto that stage in a simple dark suit, his posture confident but not arrogant, I felt my throat tighten with pride and fear in equal measure. He stood at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and let a moment of silence settle over the audience before he spoke. "My name is Ethan Walsh." He began, his voice clear and steady. "I was born in shame. My grandfather called me a mistake. My aunt told my mother not to bring me to her wedding because my existence was too embarrassing to acknowledge. According to the family I was born into, I wasn't supposed to exist. But I'm standing here today because one woman, my mother, refused to let their judgment define her or me." The room went absolutely silent, thousands of people leaning forward, phones already recording. Ethan continued, and I listened as he told our story with a grace and honesty that made my heart ache. He talked about the exile, about me sleeping in my car and working at a diner while pregnant, about the years of struggle. He shared the story of his heart surgery and the anonymous benefactor who turned out to be Eleanor, explaining how that revelation had taught him that people were more complicated than simple categories of good and evil. Then he told them about Margaret, and I held my breath. There was a woman named Margaret who gave my mother a job when no one else would, who offered her a room and taught her that forgiveness was power, not weakness. What my mother didn't know for almost 20 years was that Margaret was actually her older half-sister, the first daughter my grandmother had been forced to give up for adoption. Margaret saved my mother because she knew exactly what it felt like to be thrown away. She broke a cycle of pain by choosing love when she had every reason to choose bitterness. His voice cracked slightly with emotion, and I saw him take a breath to steady himself. She taught me through my mother that love never needs permission, that grace is stronger than revenge, that you can be exiled from a family and still build one. My mother didn't just raise a son, she raised redemption itself. And if that's what it means to be a mistake, then I'm proud to be one. The hall erupted into applause that started as scattered clapping and built into a wave of sound so loud I could feel it vibrating in my chest. People stood and more people stood until the entire audience was on their feet. But what happened next was something I hadn't anticipated. The cameras, which had been focused on Ethan, began panning across the audience, and when they found me, just a woman in a simple dress sitting 15 rows back, the people around me began to realize who I was. A woman next to me turned and stared, then started clapping while looking directly at me. Others followed, and suddenly I wasn't anonymous anymore. I was the mother, the woman whose story Ethan had just told, and thousands of people were applauding not just him, but me specifically. I felt tears streaming down my face, felt simultaneously more seen and more vulnerable than I'd ever been in my life. After the speech, as Ethan was immediately surrounded by reporters and admirers wanting to shake his hand and ask questions, I slipped out a side door into the cool evening air, needing space to breathe and process what had just happened. I'd only been outside for a few minutes when a woman approached me hesitantly. She was maybe in her 60s, gray-haired, wearing practical shoes and a cardigan that had seen better days. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you his mother?" I nodded, not quite trusting my voice. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I was a single mother too, 30 years ago. They told me I'd ruined my life, that I'd never amount to anything, that my daughter would suffer for my mistakes. Thank you. Thank you for surviving, for showing us it's possible, for proving they were wrong." Before I could respond, she hugged me, this stranger who'd carried her own story of exile and survival, and when she walked away, others approached. One by one, quietly, almost reverently, people came to share their stories. A young woman who'd been kicked out at 16 when her parents learned she was gay. A man who'd been raised in foster care and told he'd never be worth anything. A grandmother who'd raised her daughter's children after her daughter's addiction took her. They thanked me not for doing anything extraordinary, but simply for existing, for surviving, for being visible proof that you could be thrown away and still build a life worth living. I realized in those moments that my story had never been just mine. It was a mirror for thousands, maybe millions of people who'd felt unseen and unwanted. For the first time, I understood the full scope of what Ethan and I had built together, not just a foundation or a community center, but a legacy of visible survival for all the invisible people the world had tried to forget. That night, as strangers thanked me for simply existing, I heard Margaret's voice again. "You were always supposed to matter, Jenny. Now the world knows it too." 5 years passed in the way years do when you're fully living them rather than just surviving them, quickly and slowly, at the same time, each day meaningful, but the accumulation of them feeling sudden when you stopped to look back. By 2040, I was 53 years old, and Margaret's place had expanded to 3 locations across neighboring counties, each one a sanctuary for women who needed to know that exile didn't have to be permanent, that being thrown away didn't determine your worth. I'd never sought fame or publicity after that night in Washington, had in fact actively avoided it, but I'd become something of a quiet legend in my community. The woman who'd survived the unsurvivable and built an empire of compassion from the wreckage. I still wore simple clothes, still made coffee myself most mornings, still sat with women at our scarred wooden tables and listened to their stories, because listening was sometimes the most powerful thing you could offer someone who'd spent their life being ignored. The anger that had lived in my chest for so many years had transformed completely the way coal becomes diamond under enough pressure and time. I thought of Margaret, often her face as clear in my memory as if she'd died yesterday rather than a decade ago, and I understood now why she'd never told me we were sisters, because she'd wanted to save me without the weight of obligation or guilt, had wanted her love to be pure rather than complicated by blood and history. I thought of Eleanor too, and even Harold, not with the burning resentment I'd once carried, but with a sad understanding that hurt people, that they'd been casualties of their own fears and the toxic values they'd been taught to prize above humanity. Healed people heal people, and I'd spent these years trying to be one of the healers, trying to break cycles rather than continue them. Ethan called me one afternoon in early autumn to ask if I'd come visit him at the Quiet Heart Foundation headquarters. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice carrying a note of excitement that made me curious. I drove to the building downtown, a renovated warehouse that the foundation had transformed into bright, open offices full of young people working on programs that changed lives. Ethan's office was on the top floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and when I walked in, I found him standing by his desk, with a smile that suggested he'd been planning this moment. We talked for a while about the usual things: upcoming programs, funding challenges, a new partnership with another nonprofit. But I kept noticing him glancing at something behind his desk, waiting for me to see it. Finally, I turned to look at what he was so eager to show me, and my breath caught in my throat. The wall behind his desk featured 3 framed photographs arranged in a triptych, each given equal prominence and mounted at the same height as if they were a single work of art meant to be viewed together. The first photograph showed Margaret, maybe in her early 50s, laughing in what I recognized as her old coffee shop, her face full of life and warmth and the kind of joy that comes from choosing kindness when bitterness would be easier. Ethan must have found it among Eleanor's belongings and had it professionally restored, the colors brightened and the damage repaired until Margaret looked alive again. The second photograph was of Eleanor as a very young woman, perhaps 20 years old, before marriage and motherhood, and the accumulation of fears had hardened her into someone barely recognizable as the girl in this image. Her smile was genuine, unguarded, her eyes holding a hope that hadn't yet been crushed by the weight of appearances and expectations. It was a reminder that she too had once been someone with dreams, someone who'd been wounded before she became someone who wounded others. The third photograph was of me from the Christmas 2026 event, standing at the microphone surrounded by people who'd chosen to be my family, my face radiant with something that looked like freedom, like I'd finally set down a burden I'd carried too long. Beneath the 3 photographs, a brass plaque had been mounted with words engraved in elegant script: Margaret Eleanor Jennifer. 3 generations, 3 exiles, 1 cycle broken. And below that, a second line that made my eyes fill with tears. They called them shame. They became our salvation. I walked slowly toward the wall, drawn by the power of seeing the 3 of us together like this, our stories finally connected and visible in a way they'd never been while we were living them. I reached out and touched Margaret's image tenderly, my fingers tracing the frame as if I could somehow reach through glass and time to the woman who'd saved me. "I miss her every day," I whispered to Ethan, my voice thick with emotion. Then I moved to Eleanor's photograph, this young woman who'd carried so much pain for so long. I wish I'd understood her sooner. Finally, I looked at my own image, seeing myself the way others apparently saw me, not broken or diminished, but radiant with hard-won grace. "I look free," I said, almost surprised by the observation. Ethan came to stand beside me, his presence solid and comforting in the way it had been since he was a child, who instinctively understood what I needed. "You are free, Mom," he said softly. "You freed all of us. You broke the cycle that Margaret started breaking. You turned pain into purpose and showed me how to do the same." I turned to face my son, this extraordinary man who'd been called a mistake, but had become living proof that love and grace were more powerful than shame and rejection. "No, honey," I said, my voice catching. "You freed us. You took all that pain and turned it into something that helps thousands of people. You made meaning from suffering." Ethan shook his head gently, that slight smile playing at his lips that meant he was about to say something important. "I only knew how, because I watched you do it first, Mom. You were my teacher in everything that mattered. These 3 women..." He gestured to the photographs. "They're all teachers, each one showing the next generation how to be stronger than the last, how to choose love over fear." We stood there together, mother and son, looking at a family history written not in wealth or prestige, but in survival and grace, in the quiet determination to be better than the circumstances that shaped us. Outside the window, the city moved on, indifferent to our story, the way cities always are. But in this room, in this moment, 3 generations of exiled women were finally powerfully seen and honored for who they'd been and what they'd overcome. And that was how the story of shame ended, not with revenge, not with reconciliation, but with light. 3 women who were told they didn't matter, proving that love never needed permission to exist. We built a family from ashes. We turned exile into empire. And we did it quietly, gracefully, with the kind of strength the world only notices when it's too late to ignore. So that's how my story ends. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that's how it begins again every single day in the lives of women who walk through the doors of Margaret's place believing they're alone, believing they've ruined everything, believing the voices that told them they were mistakes. I get to look them in the eye and tell them what no one told me when I needed it most. You are not your worst moment. You are not what they called you. You are not the shame they tried to make you carry. You are strong enough to survive this, and on the other side of survival is a life more beautiful than you can imagine right now. My family tried to erase me. They threw me out in the rain with one suitcase and expected me to disappear quietly to become a cautionary tale they could whisper about at dinner parties. Instead, I became something they never anticipated. I became proof that love doesn't need permission, that grace is more powerful than revenge, that you can be exiled from a family and still build one. And my son, the child they called a mistake, became the man who saved them when they'd lost everything. Not because they deserved it, but because he'd learned from watching me that breaking cycles requires someone brave enough to choose mercy over bitterness. I think about Margaret every single day, my sister, the woman who saved me without ever telling me why, who let me believe her kindness was random when it was actually the most intentional thing in the world. She knew what it felt like to be given away, to be told you didn't matter, and she made sure I never felt that alone. She broke the cycle by choosing love, and I tried to honor her by doing the same with Ethan. Now he's breaking cycles for thousands of people through his foundation, and the ripples keep spreading outward in ways none of us could have predicted. If you're listening to this story and something in it resonates with you, if you've ever been told you were a mistake or a disappointment or someone who brought shame to your family, I want you to know something: they were wrong. The people who couldn't see your worth were looking through the distorted lens of their own fears and prejudices. Your value isn't determined by who accepted you or rejected you. It's determined by who you choose to become in response to both. And if you're someone who's made mistakes, who's failed the people you love in ways you can't take back, I want you to know there's still time. Eleanor didn't get to fix everything. She died with regrets that will never be fully resolved. But she did one thing right at the very end: she told the truth. She broke her silence and let me understand that her cruelty came from weakness, not from me being unworthy of love. That one act of honesty didn't erase the pain, but it gave me clarity I'd been missing for 17 years. It's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to try to break the cycle, even if you're the one who helped create it. Now I want to hear from you. Has anyone in your life ever made you feel like you were a mistake? How did you survive it? Or maybe you're the person who pushed someone away and you're carrying regret about it. What would you say to them now if you could drop your story in the comments below, because I promise you someone needs to hear it. Someone is reading these comments right now feeling alone, and your words might be exactly what saves them. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about exile and redemption and the power of grace, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been told they don't matter, someone who's struggling to forgive themselves or others. Stories like this only have power when they're shared, when they move from one heart to another and remind us that we're not as alone as we think we are. Leave a comment telling me what part of Jennifer's journey resonated with you most. Was it the moment she stood in the rain with nothing but a suitcase? The Christmas dinner where she confronted her family with grace instead of anger, the revelation about Margaret being her sister? Or maybe it was Ethan's decision to save the grandparents who'd rejected him. Tell me what you're thinking, what you're feeling, because your perspective matters, and this community grows stronger every time someone shares their truth. Thank you for listening to Jennifer's story. Thank you for being here. And remember, you were never the mistake. You were always the miracle. They just couldn't see it because they weren't looking with eyes of love. But I see you. This community sees you. And your story matters.